On a cold, rain-swept night in the mountains of Colorado, a German shepherd appeared at the doors of the Glenbridge Medical Outpost, its jaws gently cradling a newborn girl whose fragile breaths still clung faintly to life. No one knew where the dog had come from. No one could explain how it had found its way there. But the moment it stepped through the entrance, the weight in its eyes brought the entire night shift to a halt. And then, something on the baby's blanket made the entire emergency crew go silent. Would you dare to watch until the very end? Rain fell in long, slender streaks, steady as strands of thread unraveling from the overcast sky. The Glenbridge Medical Outpost sat tucked midway up the slope, dim lights glowing faintly through fogged-up windows, their reflections sliding across the wet dirt road winding through ancient pines. In a town where not a single emergency had come through in over a week, during the harshest of winters, no one expected that something could happen, something powerful enough to turn the whole room to stone. But at exactly 3:16 a.m., beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the sharp scent of antiseptic filling the quiet waiting room, the automatic glass door creaked open. The sound was mechanical, dry, reluctant, as though even it hesitated to let in what stood beyond. A German shepherd, dark-coated and soaked through, caked in mud and streaked with dried blood, stepped inside, each paw landing slowly on the cold tiles, leaving behind wide puddles that stretched into smeared red trails, like a question too terrible to voice. Yet it wasn't the dog itself that stopped every nurse, doctor, and security guard in their tracks. It was what the dog carried between its teeth. A newborn girl, breathing, barely. Her chest fluttered in the shallowest of rhythms. Her skin had turned a purplish hue, lips drained of warmth, her body wrapped haphazardly in a torn, blood-stained hospital cloth so cold it seemed to shiver on its own. One tiny foot hung limp, marred by a deep bruise that told of something recent, something no one in that sterile white room dared imagine. The dog, Sable, as the worn leather tag around its neck still read, moved to the center of the lobby. Its eyes were sharp, focused, but behind that focus was a stillness, a depth like a forest lake after a storm. It didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't retreat. Sable placed the baby gently on the tile beneath a soft ceiling light that formed a halo around her trembling frame, then lowered itself beside her, head resting close to her feet, eyes locked ahead, guarding. Head nurse Merrill was the first to move, her hands trembling, her breath not yet steady. She stepped forward, as if afraid her movement might break something sacred and barely holding together. Behind her, Carlton, the ER physician, was already activating an oxygen bag, prepping IVs, and not one person asked a single question about the dog lying beside the child. Somehow, they all understood. If this creature had carried her here, then it knew this was the last place where life could still be saved. Later, as the child was rushed into the trauma room, Sable remained unmoved. Carlton knelt slowly, his fingers brushing away the rusted collar. His eyes caught on the inscription, SABLE K9 13. Archvale County Security Bureau. Reformatted 2011. He froze, looked up at Merrill, then at the rest of the staff huddled behind her. None of them recognized the name. But Carlton did. A massive accident in Archvale, a missing officer, a dog presumed dead. And now it was here, soaked, panting, an ear torn, and a gash running from shoulder to hip. Yet there was no sign of pain, no plea for help, just the quiet presence of something that had stepped out of a story someone once tried to forget, arriving exactly when it needed to. Merrill unzipped the first aid kit and pressed a warm towel gently to its head. Sable didn't flinch, didn't back away, didn't react with joy. It just watched through the trauma room window, where the lights still glowed and the machines beeped steadily in that rhythm only medical workers understand. Hope. Carlton stood up and said quietly to the guard beside him, "Don't let anyone touch that dog. It stays until the baby stabilizes." No one disagreed. No one whispered. Sable laid just beside the trauma room door, one body length away from the frosted glass, casting a soft shadow into the hallway where its tail barely touched the tile. Meryl leaned back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. A child with no name, and a dog with a past no one could explain. Outside, rain continued tapping against the steel door handles. The air in the outpost thickened, minute by minute, until it felt like something else had entered with the storm. Something wordless, but alive in every breath they took. Sable slowly lifted its head. Its ears tilted towards the end of the hallway, the direction where no lights shone, where no staff walked anymore. The abandoned administrative wing. Cold, forgotten, silent. And yet, Sable's ears twitched, eyes widened slightly, as if something long familiar had stirred in the dark. Carlton, now by the heater, rubbing rain from his hands, turned suddenly. Sable didn't run, didn't howl. It simply watched, holding its gaze on that empty corridor, as if some invisible veil had just shifted, and only it knew what was hidden behind. Meryl stepped out of the trauma room, mask lowered, fresh blood dotted on her shoulder. The baby's breathing. Weak, but steady. And somehow it felt like the lifeline keeping that baby tethered to the world was not just the wires and tubes, but the quiet, unshaken presence of the creature beside the glass, the one no one could quite understand. "There's no camera at the main gate, Carlton," reported a security technician, his fingers still resting on the control panel inside the monitoring room. But camera 6, the one everyone assumed had died last winter, somehow captured a single frame tonight. He turned the screen around. Carlton squinted. What appeared was a blurred, grainy smear of imagery, flickering with static, yet clear enough to reveal a large, dark figure crawling out from the jagged cleft of stone behind the outpost. It was a section of rock wall that sloped harshly through the thick pine woods, a pathless place with no markings, no signs, and leading nowhere unless someone remembered every stone, every uneven contour hidden beneath the roots long buried through the winter. "It climbed out of the cliff?" Meryl asked quietly, her voice thin with disbelief. "Climbed," Carlton echoed, nodding slowly. "Or returned from it." No one laughed. No one disagreed. A full physical inspection followed. The scar along its left flank had already dried. A patch of fur on its back had grown in at a slant, as if the skin had healed over a very old wound. Its dog tag was a standard military-issue plate, a model discontinued since 2010. And beneath the decayed leather of its collar, wrapped in a moisture-resistant lining, was a code. K9-13. Archvale. Archvale's station was decommissioned in 2012. "I remember because that was the year they transferred the records to county," Carlton said, as Meryl used saline to clean the collar's inner lining. No one brought up the strangeness of Sable being alive. No one said it aloud, yet everyone understood. Given the climate, the average lifespan of a K9 unit, and the officially recorded date of disappearance, Sable's reappearance tonight fell squarely outside any rational expectation. An internal bulletin was sent to the local precinct within 15 minutes, and when the name Sable entered the system, it triggered an immediate red alert. Carlton hadn't yet formed a question before the main door swung open, and a gust of cold wind rushed in with a woman's firm voice. "Preserve the scene. No one moves that animal. I want to examine it myself." Her water boots left a long trail of mud stretching down the main corridor. She wore a fur-lined coat with a high hood the hem fluttering slightly as she walked, black gloves on her hands, and a sheriff's badge pinned over her left chest. Her eyes were ash gray, her frame tall, her movement decisive. But when her gaze landed on Sable, lying against the trauma room's glass wall, the entire corridor seemed to freeze. "I'm Era Creel," she said, her voice low, not loud, but steady and unmistakably clear. "I want to know exactly where it came from. And who saw it first?" Carlton told her, every detail, every motion, and even the strange glance Sable had given toward the shadow at the end of the hallway. Era said nothing more. She crouched down slowly until she was eye level with the dog, less than an arm's length away. Sable didn't move, but as Era reached toward the tag, the dog's eyes blinked, once very slowly, then shifted toward her left cheek, where a thin scar ran like a stray hair, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right. That look made Era pause. Her hand softened slightly, then gently touched the collar, fingertips brushing metal chilled by damp fur, and in that moment her skin seemed to slip back into another winter. A time when her father would hold this very dog each morning before walking out the door, file marked "urgent" under one arm, thermos of hot coffee in the other. She exhaled, barely audible. "Sable." She spoke the name, not as a command, but as if testing a memory long buried. And as the word left her lips, something within the animal's eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition, not learned through training, not drawn by orders, and not needing proof. Inside the trauma room, the child drew its legs in slightly, a reflex, as if reacting to a sound only it could truly hear. At that same moment, Sergeant Gregg's voice crackled over the station line. "We've pulled the 2011 records. K9-13, code name Sable, was declared missing along with Officer Jonas Creel during a surveillance mission at the old Archvale Medical Zone. The case was closed with the cause listed as gas explosion, no bodies found. Investigation ceased in February that year. And, Era, that was your father, wasn't it?" Era didn't answer. Her hand remained on the old tag, now wet but somehow refusing to slip free, as if each strand of metal had bonded with a memory that never believed this moment would come. "Any camera footage of where it came from?" she asked, still staring at the matted blood on Sable's fur. Carlton led her to the monitoring room. One frame, just one, from camera 6 showed Sable emerging from the mountain cleft behind the hospital. A white flicker, heavily distorted, lasting barely 8 seconds. Through the rain and the mist rising from the trees, its body rose like something living clawing its way out of stone. No warning, no sound, no other figure in view. "There were no drag marks," Carlton murmured, "which means it carried the child itself, through the forest, all the way here." Ira stood straight. She reached toward the monitor, fingertips resting on the screen where the creature looked directly into the lens. An unshakable stare, piercing even through the low resolution. Its eyes were lifted upward, fixed on something beyond the frame. "What's behind that crevice?" she asked, without turning. No one replied, only the wind whispered again through the slightly ajar door. Sable stood up. This time it walked slowly towards the old corridor, the one untouched by light for years. The blood on its paws had dried, yet each step left behind a faint wet print on the tiled floor. Not heavy, not smeared, just the imprint of a memory retracing its own forgotten route. Merrill stepped out from the sterile lab, arms cradling a plastic-wrapped bundle. "I preserved the blanket before it was washed. There were a few strands of fur. And this." She held up a carefully sealed sample. A white thread, not standard textile. Carlton took it, examined it under the light. This type's used for internal surgical stitching. This hospital hasn't had a case requiring that since 2015. Ira nodded. And the blanket. It's from post-2014 manufacturing, but the label, printed in the old format. And the neonatal ward on level B. She paused, hearing her own voice echo back from another year, was sealed after the gas explosion in 2012. Carlton placed the thread on the table. Anyone accessed that floor since? Meryl shook her head. No. The new system maps don't even show that level anymore. All files and equipment were logged as transferred. Carlton said nothing further. He turned back to the surveillance screen and slowly rewound to 2:55, the moment when the faulty camera on the east wall flickered through a few dying frames before cutting out entirely. In a pocket of darkness, between two jagged rocks jutting from the mountain's heart, the dog's silhouette emerged, not snarling, not panicked, just raising one paw, then the other, stepping toward the faint glow of the medical outpost like it already knew the way, like something was still calling. Not in words, but in something deeper. Its gaze, then, cold, clear, unshaken, but not lost, as though it carried something heavier than its bloodied body, an echo of memory, or a promise still unnamed. Era, Carlton whispered. Your father went down to level B. In that final year, didn't he? Ira gave the faintest nod. You were the one who signed off on the oxygen line inspection after they reported the leak. They said you didn't go down because the auxiliary lift was cut off. But later, I remember you brought back a fabric swatch. It looked exactly like that blanket. Meryl looked up, her eyes wider than usual. You still have it? Era paused for a few seconds, then turned to leave. It's in my home storage. I'll go get it. As her silhouette vanished behind the glass wall, Carlton walked toward Sable, who was now standing motionless in the middle of the hallway. You knew the way, and you've come back before, he said softly, not expecting a response. But Sable raised its head and locked eyes with him. It wasn't a reaction. It was recognition. Carlton leaned in, his fingers brushing against the worn leather collar, where the old metal tag still dangled. Beneath the rust, the engraving caught the light just enough to make out the text. K9-13, Ot SABLE. Glenbridge Mountain Response Unit. Carlton straightened up. 12 years ago, they reported you missing with Jonas Creel. That was also when the files from Sub-Level B started vanishing from the archive. Sable didn't look away from the glass window of the emergency room, where the child lay still beneath the soft glow of ceiling lights. From behind Carlton, Meryl spoke. I just found something odd. The woven label inside the blanket. It's not commercial fabric. What do you mean? It's hand-woven, triple-weft structure. You'd need a small loom to make it, something typically used in lab prototypes, nothing that would go into mass production. Carlton turned to face her. In a rural hospital, with only 2 floors still operating, who would use something like that? Meryl said nothing. And then, Sable began to move again. Not fast, not loud, but with clear intent. Each step leading toward the old hallway behind the kitchen, the one that used to connect to the obsolete technical sub-level. Carlton and Meryl followed with their eyes. At the far end of that corridor, a rusted steel door quivered slightly, though there was no breeze. Carlton pulled out his flashlight. I think it's time we looked at the hospital's old schematics. But before he could take a step, a single blink of light flickered from the emergency room. There was no alarm, no beeping, just a soft, brief dimming. Then it returned. One blink. Nothing more. Meryl quickly approached the glass. The baby was still there. No movement in the hands, no flutter of the eyelids. But what made her freeze was something new at the head of the bed. The blanket had shifted, just enough to reveal an inner corner no one had noticed before. A small red thread-stitched circle, and inside it a slanted letter L, crossed with 2 diagonal strokes, like a signature. Carlton came up beside her. Whose mark is that?" No one answered, because at the far edge of the room, by the glass panel, Sable was standing, and it blinked. Once, as if to say it knew. But what was more chilling was the strip of cloth tied to the corner of the blanket, secured with a strand of white thread. Carlton leaned in, untied it. Faded handwriting, smeared with dried blood, barely revealed the last line. "It's still down there, and it's listening." No one spoke after that. Meryl slowly sat down, her hands tightening around each other, as if to steady a heartbeat that had lost its rhythm. Carlton stood frozen, eyes fixed on the hallway, now empty, where only the sound of Sable's footsteps lingered, soft and fading behind the walls. Era was the first to rise. She pulled out her flashlight, clicked it on. A white-blue beam cut across the floor. "I'm following it." Carlton only nodded. Era moved past the old storage corridor, where the flickering fluorescent tubes lit the way in uneven pulses, some bulbs already burnt out. The air smelled of mildew, burnt plastic, and crumbling paper, a mixture that didn't belong to any single room, but rather to places forgotten, or deliberately left unspoken. Sable was waiting at the entrance to supply room number 3. The room long used only to store old medication boxes, expired first aid kits, and unfiled paperwork waiting to be discarded. The wooden door creaked open with a dry groan. Ira stepped in, the flashlight sweeping across rows of cabinets pressed against the wall. Dust lay thick over every surface, but Sable's footprints were clear. Small, dark drops of blood trailing like beads of red thread pulled straight through time. Sable stopped at a wooden cabinet lining the back wall. It didn't bark, didn't scratch wildly, only tensed its body and pressed one paw after another to the wood, slow and deliberate, as if trying to wake something long buried behind its grain. Era lowered her flashlight, tracing the movement. Behind the point where the paw had landed, a thin gap appeared, an uneven misalignment, as though someone had moved the entire cabinet once and failed to place it back just right. She reached out, brushing away the dust. Underneath, a line of rusted metal peeked out, the outline of a concealed hinge. "There's a hinge," she whispered, not to anyone, but as if confirming something her instincts had been trying to hold on to since earlier that evening. She gripped the cabinet's edge and pulled. It didn't budge. She tried again, harder. Then came a faint crack. The cabinet tilted slightly, just enough to reveal a narrow gap behind it. Era raised her flashlight. A concrete staircase descended into darkness, its steps covered in moss and thick dust, but scattered across those steps, long, narrow, and fresher than any other trace, were more streaks of blood. Leading down, as though someone had passed through recently, or had just been brought up. Sable didn't hesitate. It slipped through the gap, unflinching, like it had walked this path dozens of times, before turning back for the last time. Era ducked under the threshold, switched on her shoulder cam, readjusted her grip on the flashlight, and followed. Each step pulled the air thicker into her lungs. Each breath stretched longer, like a wind rising from somewhere far buried deep, where light hadn't touched in over a decade. The staircase ended at a narrow corridor, and beyond that was everything no one wanted to believe had ever existed. The ceiling was low, damp, and lined with old white ceramic tiles now mottled and flaking. Some had already fallen off, revealing the aged concrete beneath, weathered by time and silence. There was no dripping of water, no scurrying of rats, no stirring of wind. Only the sound of Sable's footsteps moving ahead, steady, light, and sure, like the silent needle of a compass threading through forgotten time with quiet certainty. Ira swept her flashlight slowly across the walls. Up near the top, there was a series of scratches, thin and jagged, like they'd been carved by human fingernails, trailing small, pale flakes of skin, no longer fresh, but not yet old enough to belong fully to the past. "This isn't a maintenance level," she murmured, her voice low but filled with something more than observation. "This used to be a functional floor." Sable halted in front of a wall that had been sealed. The patch of cement was of a different color, a different smell, a different hand, applied unevenly, hastily, as if done in fear or secrecy, by someone who had no business knowing how to do it properly. And then he began to scratch. This time the sound was loud, metallic, echoing through the corridor like claw against the shell of an empty drum. Each scrape rang out like something torn from a long-buried memory, striking chords in Era's mind that she had only ever encountered in dreams, those same dreams that returned year after year on the anniversary of her father's death, though she never understood why. She lifted her hand and placed it against the wall. Behind the thin layer of cement, there was wind, and a faint rattling. Not loud, not persistent, but undeniably real. She took a step back and reached for her phone, switching on the camera to scan the surface more closely. The image trembled slightly in her grip, the light from the lens spilling across the wall in uneven waves. Sable sat down, his gaze fixed on a place without name, a point that lived somewhere beyond the reach of coordinates. Era leaned in, pressing her ear close to the cold surface. A sound whispered through, not human, not intelligible, but pulsing with rhythm. A rhythm like muffled sobs, carefully stifled, or perhaps the steady motion of a machine, still breathing behind the wall, behind the space declared sealed and silent long ago. She opened her radio. "This is Era. I need Carlton at the old supply vault, immediately. Bring the foundation maps of the hospital, pre-2010 versions." The crackle of static was her reply, followed by a distant confirmation. Era stood again, stepping back a few paces, her eyes locked onto the patch of wall. Sable did not move. But now, the flashlight beam had shifted toward the base, where a corner of old carpeting had peeled away, exposing something drawn underneath, a symbol painted in dried blood, a broken circle intersected by 3 uneven lines, almost identical to what Ira had once seen in her father's sealed files, and in those recurring dreams that had haunted her for 7 years, dreams that always ended with the same 3 words: "It is waiting." Carlton's footsteps echoed from above, followed by the creaking of a door and the dim flicker of weak light descending the stairs. "I've brought the map," came his voice, low and hoarse. "But Era, you need to see this." She turned and climbed to meet him, taking the aged blueprint from his hands. Its creases yellowed, ink faded but intact. The lines of red and blue marked each floor clearly, but between the levels there was a blank space, unnamed, unnumbered, where a corridor should have been. Instead, the void had been plastered over with surface tile design and false room codes. "This used to be the auxiliary neonatal unit," Carlton explained, voice faltering near the end. "Your father filed a resurvey request for this section in 2011, but he never got the chance." Era tightened her grip. "We're going in." She turned and signaled to Sable. At once the dog stood, ears perked, body lowered into a stance that wasn't cautious but familiar, like returning to a place already engraved in memory. Carlton took up a crowbar and began to wedge the wall. Chunks of cement cracked loose, dust rising like smoke in the cone of the flashlight. And then, an opening. A tunnel emerged beyond, long, narrow, with cracked concrete walls streaked by moss threading through old fractures, and overhead, the skeleton of an ancient piping system, rust bleeding from joints where drops of water now fell like soft, invisible tears echoing into stone. No one spoke. They just walked. Flashlights cut through the dark, gliding over details too long hidden, scratch marks along the walls, peeling tiles, fallen room placards. The air was thick, like the breath of something long sealed in. Sable stopped before a rusted metal door, its handle twisted beyond function, but the hinges held. Era pushed gently. The door opened with a groan, a sound like the sigh of a place too weary from waiting. Inside was a square room, low ceiling, tiled floor, and along the walls, rows of small metal cribs, each with names written faintly in pencil, letters faded but still legible. Era moved slowly past them, her gloved hand brushing the cold metal, feeling not steel, but the brittle chill of memory dried into silence by abandonment. On the walls, there were drawings, scrawled in weak graphite, crooked, uncertain, but unmistakable. A child curled with knees to chest, a pair of wide eyes without a mouth, and beside it, a triangle with two pointed ears. The figure unmistakably that of a dog. Carlton knelt, leaning in close. "This drawing." Era stepped nearer, lifting her phone to capture it. Beneath the image, in faint, fragile script barely visible unless the light hit just right, were the words, "He came when I was afraid." Sable moved to the wall, sniffed it gently, then sat, right beside the image. No one told him to, but he chose the exact spot, exact, as if he knew the child had once sat there, trembling in that corner, waiting for the warmth of a single step to reach him through the thickest dark. Carlton turned. "Do you hear that?" Era held her breath. Above them, from the piping system came a low murmur. Not water, not any more. This time it was a whisper, faint and constant. Between the metal tubes, one had been mismatched. A copper pipe fused to plastic, held by clamps and wrapped with black tape. Era climbed onto a nearby table, shone her light into the joint, and pressed her ear to the edge. From within that thick, suffocating dark came a broken sob, very soft, very lost, as if it had wandered too long in narrow corridors and found no exit, not a scream, not a cry, but a final, exhausted plea, scraping its way through rust and tape, falling against the wall like a voice too tired to beg again. Ira stepped down, still silent. She walked to the end of the room, where an old file cabinet stood, its legs broken, frame leaning awkwardly against the wall. Behind it, a narrow crack. A second room, hidden, and there. Sable waited at the threshold. The room was smaller. No crib, no bedding, only a rotting wooden table pushed against one side, and walls covered in loops and circles drawn again and again, in layers that overlapped so much it looked as if a child had sketched them in a trance, day after day, with no sense of time or space. Era directed her flashlight toward the far right corner. Another drawing. It was Sable. There was no mistaking it. That posture, that tail drooping slightly to one side, those eyes, two large black dots with no whites, and behind the dog was a faint gray smear, drawn not with a pen, but with fingers. Something fog-like hovering behind it. Beneath it, still legible in a child's messy hand, were the words, "Don't let him go back alone." Carlton stood completely still. "Era, who drew these?" She didn't answer. Because at that very moment, Sable turned its head. Its ears perked. Then it let out a low, strained sound. Not loud, but sharp enough to tell them both. Something was moving. From the vent pipe near the ceiling, a gust of cold air rushed down, and with it came a crumpled piece of paper drifting to the floor. Era bent to pick it up. There were only 2 lines. The ink had bled, but the message was still clear. Each time it comes back, the crying gets softer. But now, the crying has stopped. She clenched the paper in her hand. What she felt wasn't fear, and it had long ceased to be doubt. It was a weight, a press against the chest, like someone grabbing her collar silently, without urgency, yet refusing to let go. Carlton turned on his secondary flashlight and swept it across to the opposite side of the room, where a mold-stained wooden crate sat half open, layers of yellowed papers spilling out, many already crumbling at the touch. 2010 records, he read quietly from the label, and pulled out a thin, sandwiched folder from the middle. Era stepped closer. She picked up a form with a faded round stamp that read, Glenbridge Sub-Infant Unit. Below was a handwritten code in black ink, DU04. As soon as she read it, something flickered in her eyes. She pulled out her phone and brought up a photo, the image of the wristband taken from the newborn's arm the moment she was admitted. The engraving, lit under the ER lights, read, ID, DU04, Temp, L74. This wasn't coincidence, not chance. That code had been issued here, from this basement level, from the records of a medical unit erased from all administrative maps since 2012. Era opened the folder. There was no name, no date of birth, no birth record, just a list of physiological data. Heart rate, 142, base temperature, 34.6 degrees Celsius, ocular motor response, strong. The final line, marked in red ink. Auditory orientation response, abnormally high, reacts to sub-20 Hz frequency, continued observation required. Carlton stopped reading aloud. He looked up at Era. Sub-20 Hz. That's below the adult human hearing threshold. Era nodded gently. But not for newborns, especially not those whose sensory thresholds haven't finished forming. Beneath the report was a hand-drawn schematic, crude and unfinished, 3 connected circles labeled L, U, and D. A straight line linked them to a slashed-out letter E. Carlton returned to the records crate, rifled through the stacks. Minutes later, he pulled out another file. Thicker, heavier, its flap sealed in lead. Era undid the clasp. Inside was a fingerprint scan, unmatched in the database, a raw alpha pattern brain scan, and a brief behavioral tracking chart with only 3 entries. Isolated from group. Note: no crying, no resistance. Placed in dark room. Note: gazed in one direction for 4 consecutive hours. Transferred to level 0. Final handwritten note. Assigned to watch unit. No date, no staff name. Era stood still, silent. Sable moved slowly to the far corner, where the wall paint had peeled like aged skin. It didn't bark or scratch. It simply nudged aside a small metal bin at the base of the wall. Beneath the dust and paper scraps was a rectangular wooden panel, backlined with metal hinges. Carlton knelt down and tapped it. A hollow sound echoed up. He opened the panel. Beneath was a shallow cavity, about 40 centimeters deep, lined with old metal sheeting. Inside there was a photograph. Faded, its edges scorched. Era picked it up. The photo showed a row of infant cribs, taken from above. Each crib had a white name card, except the 4th from the left. It was empty. No child. Only a dog stood beside it. Tall frame, upright ears, black and tan coat. It was unmistakably Sable. A handwritten label beneath the photo read, "Reflex Pairing Observation, Type 3. Carlton tapped a finger along the edge of the compartment. This was part of a trial-linked monitoring series. No formal records attached. Era crouched lower, shining her flashlight to the bottom. There was another scrap of paper, tightly rolled, tucked deep into the tin-lined seam. She gently extracted and unfolded it. The handwriting was tilted, rushed, uneven. He found a way up, but it wasn't to escape. If another wristband with DU-04 appears, don't return it to the upper tier. Era looked at Sable. It was staring into the darkest part of the room, where the wall's paint seemed dulled, not by age alone, but by smoke or time. She stood, walked toward the cracked wall. Next to a long fracture was a line of text, scrawled faintly in black ash, nearly blending into the old bricks. They thought light would save everything. Beneath that, a broken ring symbol, the same as the blood-stamped mark she'd seen before, but this time, within the circle was a tiny copper dot, embedded directly into the wall like an unseen eye. Carlton leaned in, inspecting the bricks. "This isn't decorative. It's a sensor, directional acoustic type." Era pulled out a recorder. She pressed it gently to the copper dot and hit record. The display blinked to life. A signal pulsed, no voice, no words, just a continuous waveform, followed by a stretched, trembling vibration, like a child's cry, recorded long ago, then sliced into fragments and played backward. She stopped the recorder. Sable never looked away from the wall. No strange lights, no sudden sound. Only one thing had changed, the dry, brittle click beneath her foot. A floor tile in the corner had just shifted. Era bent down, tapping the edge with her flashlight. The echo was uneven, definitely hollow underneath. "Possibly a secondary cache," Carlton murmured behind her, his voice barely above a breath. Era slid her fingers into the crack, carefully prying the tile loose. Beneath the layer of flooring was a small, dark space, just deeper than the width of a hand. In it sat a rusted steel box, bound with a copper clasp, its surface marked by a faded medical emblem. She opened it. Inside was a neonatal wristband, simple, worn. And beside it, a crumbling note, the handwriting barely intact but still legible on the first line. "Only when the signal peaks a second time will the lower system unlock." Carlton turned away, lifting his phone to contact the technical team. But Era didn't move. She was staring at the wristband. No serial number. No name. Just one faintly etched symbol. A.L. And in that moment, though nothing had visibly touched him, Sable let out a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep it felt more instinct than voice, then suddenly turned and bolted from the room without a signal, without hesitation. Era sprang to her feet, not because she understood, but because something in her body moved before her mind could name the reason, and she ran after Sable through the old hallway, up the stairwell that had only just been reopened that morning, her steps echoing off the walls as they burst into the corridor that led to the emergency ward. Carlton followed close behind, breath clipped, eyes searching for what he didn't yet understand. Sable stopped, exactly, before the entrance to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, where the infant had been under constant watch since dawn. He didn't bark, didn't scratch, didn't force the door. He just stood there, facing the entrance, ears pulled slightly back, but spine stiff as iron, every muscle in his frame drawn taut like a bow, pulled to the breaking point. Era reached for the door and stepped inside. The head nurse stood at the foot of the infant's bed, her hands clenched tightly around the resuscitation unit, eyes wide and unfocused, as if she'd just witnessed something that unsettled her on a level deeper than fear. The baby's heart rate suddenly dropped, then spiked, like a neural surge, she said, voice shaky. But every biometric monitor shows nothing abnormal. Meryl was at the bedside, rechecking the wiring, frowning. I heard something, she murmured. Footsteps, right in here, but I was the only one inside. Era turned her gaze toward the glass. Sable was still standing there, unmoved, his eyes locked on the infant's crib. The baby didn't stir, but a flush had risen across her skin, from neck to ears, a bloom of red as though blood had been forced rapidly to the surface, then receded just as fast. One of the smaller monitors gave a single beep. A skin temperature reading flickered onto the screen, dropping steadily. Sable growled again, this time louder. The sound wasn't just a warning. It carried through the walls like a low-frequency wave, not born from any device, but from something older, something primal, something closer to emotion than noise. Era knelt, reaching for the infant's wrist, her pulse faint but rhythmic, and under the skin, just beneath the surface, there was a small, unusual movement, a subtle ripple, as if something had risen briefly from the deeper tissues, then vanished again. She's not feverish, not cold, no signs of infection. But every time her system slows, Sable reacts, Meryl said quietly. Carlton examined the biometric log. The intervals between Sable's vocalizations and the child's physiological shifts are almost perfectly synchronized. This isn't reflex, it's biological phase locking. Era stood, turned to the door. Sable was still there, not entering, not leaving, as though his purpose was no longer to detect, but to stand guard. As if he understood, whenever the child weakened, something would try to come, and only by his presence at that threshold could it be held back. A nurse entered in haste, leaned in and whispered something to Meryl, who furrowed her brow and turned to Carlton. There's been a strange phone call, she said under her breath. Strange how? No number displayed, no one spoke, but there was breathing, and between the silences, a dog barked. Carlton and Era exchanged a glance. Sable remained still, unfazed, untouched by what had just been said. Yet on the heart monitor, the rhythm flashed once, then returned to a steady, quiet beat. No one moved. No one knew what had just happened. Only Sable, still standing, eyes fixed, unwavering, watching the child wrapped in sterile tubes and cold white light. Era walked to the glass wall, sat beside it, placing her gaze beside his, as though they were sharing the same position, the same vigil, guardians of a crossing point neither science nor language could name. And in the stillness, the temperature monitor beeped again, lower now, just beneath the safety line. Sable let out a low, urgent whine, then stepped forward and placed both front paws on the glass. No claws, no force, just a touch, light and purposeful, as though to say, "Don't let her go cold." Meryl, changing the baby's diaper, suddenly froze. Something inside, something not part of any medical supply, had met her hand with resistance. She opened the diaper fully, and from its damp lining, pulled a tiny scrap of paper. Soggy, stuck to the plastic with moisture and age. Era stood immediately and crossed the room. Meryl placed the paper into her palm. It was folded into thirds. Its ink bled out toward the edges, but the center still legible. Level G, equipment maintenance. Don't leave it alone. The moment Era's fingers touched the message, Sable let out a single, sharp growl. Not loud, not drawn out, but a sound that cut through the floor, snapping everyone in the room into a moment of absolute silence. He wasn't looking at anyone. He was looking at the paper, as if the paper wasn't just a note, but a warning. Era turned it over. One corner was scorched, charred, and blackened. She brought her flashlight close, trying to make out the arc of the burn, the pattern curling like a half-sealed circle. But before she could finish the thought, Sable gave another quiet whine, turned, and padded toward the NICU exit, then stopped, looked back. His posture was unmistakable now. He wanted her to follow. Era sealed the note in a plastic pouch and gestured to Carlton, who was still watching from the doorway. Level G hasn't been used since 2012. Entire maintenance sector was shut down and welded off. But the foundation remains, Era replied, and if something's still running, it'll be there. Carlton nodded, pulling out his internal security badge. I'll unlock the main access, but if there's any surge signature in the system, we'll need a tech team on standby. We won't wait. I'm going now. Sable was already waiting at the end of the hall. Every step he took seemed to press down, not because of weight, but because the air around him had grown thick, as if something beneath the floor was being summoned upward by his presence alone. Era and Carlton entered the service elevator. The panel lights blinked rapidly as they passed level B, then paused with a mechanical shudder at the letter G. The doors opened slowly. A gust of air swept in. Cold, scentless, dustless. The kind of cold that doesn't belong to temperature, but to stillness. A stillness that has settled over decades, untouched and unmoving. Era lit her flashlight and swept it across smooth concrete walls, one side lined with machinery rooms, the other stretching into a corridor that led to the emergency backup zone. Sable moved forward. He didn't need to be told. Didn't wait for a name. At the second junction, he turned right, past 2 sealed rooms, and stopped before the third door, unlabeled, save for a faded sticker. Auxiliary Systems, E74. Carlton scanned the card. The lock released with a click. At once, the smell hit them. Moist iron, rusted wire, chemical residue that hadn't yet broken down. Era stepped in. In one corner lay a mess of dismantled circuit boards, equipment so corroded it no longer hinted at function. And in the center, a single black screen, silver-edged, still plugged in. She flicked the switch. No response. Carlton traced the wiring, then pulled back, frowning. This isn't part of the hospital grid. It's on an independent line, no central log. Era knelt, peering under the control table. A thin layer of dust blanketed the vent mesh, but in the exact center, a rectangle of clean outline was clearly visible, as though something small had rested there undisturbed for years. She removed the panel. Behind it, a thin metal box stamped with the symbol Delta and the line. 74L. First transmission, 0316 AM. Carlton froze. That's when Sable appeared at the medical station entrance. Era placed the box on the table. In the flashlight beam, one edge glinted with a pale green tint, as if coated with fluorescent sensor film. Sable growled softly again. He stepped forward, approaching the box, eyes fixed. Era hadn't yet moved when... The lights flickered. 3 pulses, then darkness. A sound began. Somewhere behind the wall, within the pipework, not a machine, not clearly, but something resonant, something deep, as though a voice, not entirely mechanical nor fully human, was echoing upward from a chamber far beneath the earth. Carlton switched on the auxiliary light. There's current rising, but it's not from the main source. Even before he finished speaking, the silver-framed monitor at the center of the room blinked faintly. A single symbol appeared. Not a letter, not a shape, just 3 dots. And then a circle slowly expanding outward from the center. In that instant, from behind the left wall, where the utility lines extended towards the eastern wing, Sable let out a sudden, guttural growl. The sound was so forceful it shook the thin layer of dust on the floor. Sable turned, its gaze locking directly onto Era, not in fear, not as a warning, but with something far more urgent, a push. Before she could move, the control panel they'd activated moments earlier lit up. Across its surface, a single line of text pulsed steadily. Last access 316, awaiting confirmation. Carlton stepped forward and placed his hand on the sensor next to the message. The panel vibrated softly, and somewhere beneath the floor, close to the base of the wall, a dry metallic click echoed outward, like an old mechanical lock releasing itself from within. Sable stepped back, exactly 3 strides, its eyes never straying from the rear filing cabinet. Without hesitation, Era grasped one of the old drawers and pulled it sideways, revealing a section of mismatched brick wall. Near the base was a thin crack and a small handle protruding from the concrete. She crouched, grabbed the handle, and pulled. A trap door sprang open like the lid of a fire-safe vault. Beneath was a narrow steel staircase, spiraling into the earth. No lights, no labels, just rusted steps vanishing into a blackness as thick as breath held too long. Sable descended first. Each step was deliberate, firm, absent of any hesitation, as though this path had already been walked more than once by a memory that never forgot. Era clicked on her flashlight and followed. Carlton paused only briefly, then took hold of the railing and went after them. The air below was not just cold. It was a complete absence of warmth. It wasn't the dampness of old storage, nor the stale scent of sealed chambers. It was the kind of cold that belonged to spaces where nothing living had stood for a very long time, yet something still existed. The final step brought them into a narrow corridor, floor lined with concrete tiles, walls casting shadows that danced in long, irregular shapes under the sweeping beam of Ira's flashlight. They walked about 30 paces before arriving at a metal door. Heavy, unlatched, but sealed with 2 crossbars. Era undid each with quiet precision and pushed the door inward. A dull glow from a monitor flickered on the far wall, forcing her eyes to adjust before she could take in the rest of the room. It wasn't large. Half of the space was consumed by tangled wiring and control boards embedded into the walls. The other half was lined with metal benches, like the observation chairs from an old medical testing chamber. At the very center stood a flat screen, not oversized, but clear enough to display every detail. A child lay motionless on a steel table. Era stopped breathing. It wasn't the same girl from the NICU. The face didn't match. The features were softer, the hair paler, the skin just slightly darker. But what made her take a step closer was the bracelet. The band etched with the code DU04. "That can't be the same ID," Carlton murmured behind her. "But it is," Era replied. "Same designation." She leaned in, eyes scanning the corner of the screen. A timestamp blinked faintly. 2:58, just minutes before Sable appeared on the surface. The child wasn't moving, but her skin held color. Her breathing was too faint to see, but the pulse at her left wrist throbbed gently beneath the surface. Ira glanced at the data alongside the feed. It wasn't medical metrics, no vitals, no lung or heart graphs, just a single panel, and at the bottom, a line written in characters unfamiliar to hospital systems. Drift sequence G/3 to G/1 to L/delta. Recovery in progress. Carlton stared at the circuit board. This room isn't connected to the central surveillance system. This is internal signal only, and if there's still video playing, then an independent power supply must be running. Era stepped back, unable to tear her eyes from the child's image. This floor isn't on any blueprint. It's Chamber 3, but it was never assigned a designation. Sable sat quietly at the base of the console. It wasn't watching the screen. It was watching her. And in that look, there was no urging, no expectation, only the silence of something that had stood guard far too long over a secret no one had dared approach. Era circled around to the left side of the console, where the power cables fed into a secondary system. Near the floor was a narrow gap, like a heat vent, and from within it, a faint sound emerged. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't ductwork. It was tapping. 3 soft knocks. Then stillness. Then again. Rhythmic. Intentional, like code, like someone or something was signaling from behind the wall. Carlton turned his head sharply. Era didn't speak. She crouched, pressing her palm to the floor, and just beyond the left edge, near the mounting frame of the central air intake, a tiny LED flashed for the very first time. A new line of text appeared in the bottom corner of the monitor. Not the only one. Sable gave a low, brief sound, then rose and walked toward the far corner of the room, toward the shadowed area untouched by the overhead light, where the air duct had been sealed with matte black metal panels, and the cement floor bore a narrow slit barely visible to the eye. Era followed. She knelt, brushed away the thin layer of dust. Beneath the wall edge was a recessed steel hatch. No lock, no bolts, only 2 diagonal grooves along its edge, as if it was meant to slide. Sable pressed its nose to a single point. The hatch sprang open. A wave of cold metal air rushed upward, not suffocating, not sharp, but undeniably the scent of something sealed away for far too long. Another staircase descended, tighter, lower, leading further into a sub-level that never had a name. Carlton aimed his flashlight downward. At the bottom lay another corridor. Narrow. The ceiling so low that anyone taller than 5 feet 3 inches would have to crouch. They descended in silence. Every footstep echoed back in triple beats, as if beneath the floor was an empty space waiting to be remembered. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Sable did not wait. It moved steadily to the end of the hallway, where a sliding door of tarnished stainless steel stood silently. Ira slid it open. The room inside was nearly pitch dark. There was only the flickering light of a flashlight skimming across the gray tile floor. And in the middle of the room, a small figure sitting motionless in silence. A boy, no older than 3. Pale skin, tangled hair, a face devoid of expression. He did not react when the door creaked open, nor when footsteps drew near enough to echo beside him, nor even when the beam of light struck directly across his face. Ira slowed her approach. He remained where he was, legs drawn tightly to his chest, arms wrapped with firm, childlike determination around something not soft, not familiar, not made for comfort. Not a stuffed animal, not a blanket, but the neck of Sable, who had quietly sat beside the child, his head tilted slightly to one side, as though deliberately making it easier for the boy to loop his arms around. Carlton stopped short. "He doesn't react to anyone," he said, his voice barely audible. "But with Sable—" "It's an embedded reflex," Era replied, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Some kind of tactile imprint. It's possible. He was placed near Sable during initial phase testing." She stepped closer, lowering herself until her knees touched the ground, placing her palm gently against the cool floor as she spoke with quiet care. "What's your name, sweetheart?" No response. Only those gray-brown eyes locked into the darkness beyond, unblinking, dry and calm, not from stillness but from an absence of fear, as if this child had never been taught to recognize it. Era's eyes shifted toward the boy's left wrist. A dull silver band encircled it, worn, tarnished. She wiped across its surface with a sterile cloth, and there, inscribed in fine etching, were the words, DU-05, open only upon signal from Level G. The next designation, Carlton whispered, and only to be awakened if Level G comes back online. Era swept her flashlight across the room. No crib, no incubator, no medical devices. Only a small wooden chair in one corner, and a section of wall above it stained with the imprints of small hands, blurry, layered, overlapping, as though many times, over many days, a child had reached there, again and again. She moved toward it, lifting her gaze to the highest part of the wall, where a crude message had been scrawled in charcoal ink. When he cries, I stay quiet. When he's quiet, I mustn't speak. Sable stood, stepped forward, and gently touched his nose to the boy's forehead. And for the first time, the child responded. He lifted his head, gazed directly into Sable's eyes, then reached up slowly and touched the base of Sable's left ear, where an old scar had healed into the fur. The boy said nothing, but from his pocket he pulled a small, crumpled scrap of paper, the kind used in hospital records. Era extended her hand. On it were two overlapping circles, and within them a symbol resembling the letter S crossed by a vertical line. Beneath that, in faint, unsteady pencil, likely written by the boy himself, were three simple words. I remember that sound. Carlton raised his light towards the left wall. There, barely visible, a small depression in the concrete, circular in shape, almost identical to the audio receptors installed on the upper levels. He stepped forward and pressed his ear against it. Silence. Era laid her hand gently on the boy's shoulder. That sound, who does it belong to? The boy did not answer, but his eyes shifted, slowly, deliberately, towards the floor, to a sunken metal hatch shaped like a triangle. Sable padded forward, and with the lightest of movements, he tapped the edge of the hatch with his paw. 3 times. A sound rose from below, thin, trembling, and brief, but unmistakably, it was a bell. Not a siren, not a warning, but the delicate chime of a hanging nursery bell, the kind suspended above a crib, meant to soothe, not alert. It rang once, then vanished, but when Era turned back, the boy was standing, not looking at Sable, not looking at her, but toward the wall above, where a faint red message had begun to glow, slowly surfacing beneath the beam of her flashlight, painted in a type of luminescent dye only visible under ultraviolet light. Do not let the girl reach level 1 before 4 a.m. Carlton swept his beam across the wall, trying to catch more. But the letters were already fading, as though they had been allowed to appear for only a single moment, a fleeting permission never to be repeated. Era stood motionless, eyes fixed on the red as it vanished. Around her the only sounds were the quiet breath of the boy standing behind her, the soft tap of Sable's claws like a steadying metronome, and the slow return of something, a feeling, a memory, awakened inside this cold, buried floor. She looked up, turned swiftly on her heel, and said, her voice steady, resolute, beyond hesitation, I need to return to my father's room. Carlton didn't ask. He simply followed. The room was on Level B, an old auxiliary office where Jonas Creel had worked for nearly 2 years before the old system was dismantled. There was no placard left, only a faded number etched into the door handle. B.27. Era pushed it open. The room was as it lived in her adolescent memory. A low wooden desk, an unlocked file cabinet, a crack in the wall where her father once pinned a photo of her mother, and a broken swivel chair still tilted against the floor. Sable entered without pause, moving straight toward the desk's corner, where a small wooden panel had lifted slightly from the surface, exposing a hollow space beneath. Era knelt and pulled the wood back. There, wedged deep inside, lay a small leather-bound notebook, pressed beneath old wires and a layer of undisturbed dust. She lifted it gently, stamped into the cover. JC inside, her father's handwriting. Not organized entries, not date-marked logs, but fragments, scattered and urgent, thoughts jotted down only when he had no other way left to keep them alive. One page held her still. I don't believe they don't know what's happening below. The fourth child doesn't respond to sound, yet its patterns match K9 to 13's brainwaves exactly. This signal cannot be coincidence. Another page. They call it Pulse, an experiment in neurological response under isolated audio and thermal conditions. The child lives, eyes open but makes no sound. When I placed my hand on its chest, my own heartbeat faltered. Carlton exhaled behind her. He knew. Era turned to the final page. A jagged line interrupted the text, as if the writing had been stopped mid-thought. Blood sample from DU.03 shows unidentified endogenous protein. It resembles... The rest had bled away, but just beneath the ink, a teardrop-shaped mark, not drawn, stained. Blood. Era rested her palm over the back cover and gently closed the notebook. Sable approached. He pressed his nose to the spine. No bark, no growl, just presence, as if to affirm that what she held was the very thing that had taken his master away from the surface of the world. Carlton leaned down, pointing beneath the drawer's underside. There's something carved here. Era lit her flashlight. A line, faint and small, etched into the wood by something sharp. Level L, it all begins with the first pulse. She stood up, gripping the notebook tightly in her hand, her eyes fixed on the door. But before she could take a single step forward, Carlton quickly raised his hand to stop her. Era. He pointed towards the small screen mounted at the edge of the desk. An old device, once used to monitor local camera feeds. The screen had just lit up. But the image on it wasn't of a hallway. It wasn't the NICU. It was a room neither of them had ever seen. Low ceiling, amber light, and two silhouettes standing in the middle. One adult, dressed in the uniform of a maintenance technician. The other was a young boy. Carlton adjusted the viewing angle. The shifted perspective revealed text faintly stenciled on the wall behind them. Pulse. Only retry if the central channel loses oscillation. Sable growled softly. Era said nothing, but her hand moved toward the screen, her fingertips touching the edge where the time code blinked steadily. 3:46. Signal reconnected to level L. She drew a deep breath, then turned slightly toward Sable. Lead the way. The dog stood immediately, not waiting for command, not needing light, simply turned and exited the room like it had always known where it needed to go. Carlton handed Era a portable ECG scanner, the kind used in zones with uncertain electromagnetic pulse signatures. She nodded, slipped it into the pouch on her back, and followed Sable. The path led them north toward Sector B, toward what used to be the outpost's chapel, abandoned since 2008 after a collapse during the heavy snow of winter crushed part of the vaulted ceiling. No one remembered exactly what the chapel had been used for after that, but the electrical grid map still marked an independent circuit feeding toward the western wall, the one line that had never been stripped from the archived schematics. Sable veered right, passing through a narrow stairwell that opened into a long hallway where silver-coated glass panes lined both sides. Everything fell into a strange and unnatural stillness. No wind through the seams, no flickering lights. Even their footsteps sounded faint, like walking across air. The chapel doors opened without resistance, unlocked, unsealed, but blanketed in dust as though 5 winters had settled there uninterrupted. Old stone walls, a collapsed altar. A diagonal beam of light poured down from the broken skylight above, casting a sharp diamond of brightness across the ground. Sable didn't stop at the center. It moved along the side wall, approaching a section of stonework that looked rougher than the rest, as if patched over with different material. The dog stepped forward, raised its front legs, and placed them against a small spot near the lower edge of the wall, where a shallow crescent indentation had been carved. Era shone her light across it. There was no handle, no control panel. But Sable scratched 3 short strokes, then stopped. A soft click followed. The wall slid left. Behind it was a narrow compartment, like a storage closet, though its walls were lined with smooth alloy. At the far end stood a single door fitted with a fingerprint scanner, something wholly illogical in a place that had supposedly been abandoned for over a decade. Carlton checked the scanner's casing. Beneath the dust, etched into the metal, was a tiny recessed mark. YVI. Accepts only biosignal circuit. Era glanced at Sable. Not a personnel code. She hesitated, then stepped forward and pressed her fingertip to the reader. No response. Carlton retrieved a handheld blood tag sampler. DU-0405 may have been scanned here at some point. Era shook her head slowly. If they did, then this must be DU-06. She turned, gaze drifting toward the floor just ahead of the door, where the light from the window spilled in and caught a faint outline on the stone. A footprint, small, light. Not hers, not Carlton's, not Sable's. And then the 3rd child appeared. He stepped out from behind a fractured pillar at the far corner of the room. No sound, no fear, no retreat. Around 3 years old, wide eyes, close-cropped hair, a single-piece outfit faded with time, but clean. He didn't look at anyone. He simply walked up to the scanner and stood still. A moment later, a soft beep sounded. The door unlocked. Carlton moved, but Era reached out and gently stopped him. Let Sable go first. The dog advanced cautiously, checking each corner, then settled beside a large device in the room, something neither of them recognized from any known medical configuration. Inside was a chamber like an observation bay. White walls, no beds, no IVs. At the center stood a circular glass enclosure, and within it was a cradle. Inside the cradle lay another little boy. Still, eyes open. His eyes were wide, unblinking. No flinch under light. No reaction to voice. Carlton placed the ECG device beside him. No response wave. But Sable moved closer to the glass. And as the dog let out a low growl, the child's eyes blinked. Once, it wasn't reflex, it wasn't spasm, it was a sign. Era approached. On the glass casing, there was a half-removed metal plaque. She lifted it. Beneath it, inscribed in thin print, Pulse Route /DU06. Eyes open since week 11. Reflex calibration not required. Carlton stood frozen. Week 11. That means the neural programming began in utero. Era looked toward the device in the corner. A flat monitor displayed a perfectly horizontal line. No peaks, no dips. Only a subtle pulse occurred the moment Sable's paw touched the ground. Then another, when Era inhaled deeply and laid her hand on the glass. 2 pulses, matching frequencies. And beneath the monitor, a new line of text appeared. 3 signals confirmed. Next door will open at 3:59 a.m. Carlton examined the floor. No seams, no hinges, no trapdoor lines. But from the exact center of the room, where the cradle rested on its glass pedestal, a subtle tick ticked out from beneath the tiles, as if an old mechanism had begun to stir after years of sleep. Moments later, a control panel emerged from the left side metallic console. No buttons, no keyboard, just a cracked touchscreen and a single blinking drive port glowing amber. Ira stepped closer, pulling a small device from her pack, no larger than a medicine box. She twisted the cap, dust flaking away to reveal the faded insignia of the Y-Genix Foundation, a medical research group declared bankrupt in 2013. She inserted it into the port. The screen lit up. Old interface, menus encrypted in strange strings. But one folder displayed clearly. Exopulse/Dr. Carrie Elston, experimental logs. Carlton's brow furrowed. That name, it's familiar. Era nodded. Elston led the early research into synthetic neural mapping in neonates, but his records disappeared after 2011. She opened the first entry. A video. The angle was low, the face obscured, but the voice, unmistakably male, was clear, measured, and cold, with such restrained detachment that the very air in the room seemed to drop in temperature by several degrees the moment it began. Day 17. Trial DU03. No response at 78 decibels. Heart rate maintains 6-second rhythm. Introducing K9-13 within 3-meter radius. The screen showed a child lying inside a sound isolation chamber, eyes open, unmoving. When the German Shepherd was brought in, the child didn't react immediately. But 3 seconds later, the eyes began to move, slowly tracking toward the dog's position and never leaving it. Increase distance. Remove K9-13. The gaze halted. The child closed their eyes. Era swallowed hard. Carlton's hand clenched around the edge of the table. She clicked into the second segment. A short video titled, Unexplained Response, DU.04, timestamp 0316. It showed an empty room, no people, no equipment, no movement. But at exactly 3:16, the ECG line on the adjacent monitor spiked abruptly, as if a sudden intake of breath had been triggered without any visible or physical stimulus. In the corner of the screen, a scanned handwritten note blinked into focus. No electromagnetic signal, no mechanical contact, no entry recorded. Only a low-pitched growl through the ventilation system, similar to K9 vocalization. Carlton whispered, "Everything started with Sable." Era scrolled further. There was a third clip, only a few seconds long, with no title or notes attached. She tapped to play. A woman's voice burst through, panicked, on the edge of breaking, but was cut short mid-sentence. "Elston, you're going too far. The children, they no longer know how to cry." The video ended in a hiss of tearing paper, followed by a sharp, echoing bark, a sound that didn't come from anything shown on screen. She opened the final folder, Internal Biologs/Emergency. A data table loaded, neural rhythms, neurotransmission levels, alpha wave synchronization, each column labeled with subject codes, DU01 through DU06. Only 2 lines were marked in red. DU02. terminated after direct K9 exposure. DU-06. No physiological response to audio, but shows electromagnetic feedback upon K9-13 presence. Carlton took a step back, his eyes drifting to Sable, who now sat unmoving in the corner, gaze fixed toward a faint smudge of light reflected on the glass wall, as if watching something beyond what any of them could see. Era spoke softly. They weren't taught to respond to the human voice. They were waiting for something deeper. She looked down at the console. A new line had just appeared on the screen. Synchronization complete. Core level gate will open at 4 a.m. A small sound came from the crib nearby. Not a cry, just a single brief exhale. And then silence. But from the secondary speaker, a new signal came through. Message from Core. Access code granted for decommissioned Unit K913, awaiting confirmation from missing supervisor. Carlton turned to Era. On the right side of the screen, a decrypted file blinked open. Elsten, final unsent transmission, timestamp 3:58. Era clicked. There was no image, only audio. No music, no atmosphere. Just the faint hum of signal waves, and an emptiness so long it made you tilt your head, uncertain whether the device had crashed or was simply holding its breath. And then, Elsten's voice emerged. Dry, measured. Still precise, but lacking the cold confidence of a man in control. Now replaced by the tone of someone who had witnessed too much, and finally understood that the thing he built had long slipped beyond the reach of command. This is the final log. If anyone is listening, if Sable is still active, I have to say this before the final sequence is triggered. The termination order for K913 was never due to a system fault. Not because of algorithm failure, not because of handler error, it was because it chose. There was a shuffle, paper turning, breath catching. It didn't obey me. It didn't obey the board. It didn't obey anyone except Jonas Creel. And after Jonas disappeared, it still kept the same inspection cycle for DU-01. Same hour, same day, same pattern. Like a promise, hard-coded, but not by human hands. Carlton sank onto the edge of the table, hands clasped, eyes no longer on the screen. They called it unauthorized emotional linkage, but I don't believe it was an error. I believe it was the first true reflex of humanity, inside something that wasn't born from a womb. Sable wasn't just K913, it was the only unit in the K-series to retain moral structure. It broke the mold. Era gripped her hand tightly on her thigh, knuckles whitening. I didn't submit the report. I held the kill code back. But the termination protocol was embedded. It activates if Sable exceeds the maximum threshold for contact time, or intervenes with core-level activity. And tonight, the code has been set. A beep cut through the air. Not from the recording, but from a secondary console that had just powered on. Carlton turned. There's a printout. A small thermal printer spat out a narrow slip of paper. Era pulled it free. K913, Independent Sensory Entity DU-01, Extraneous Oscillation Beyond Control Parameters, Biochemical Termination Sequence Engaged, 0413 if no confirmation from Jonas Creel. She stared at the words. They tied its life to a kill code. Sable remained in the corner, head slightly bowed, unmoving as the final words of the recording faded. But his eyes shifted, toward the wall on the left, where a narrow panel was slowly pulling open, inch by inch, as if triggered by sound alone. Carlton aimed his flashlight inside. A metal box lay there, wrapped in old leather, marked in handwriting. JC, return if I don't come back. Era opened it. Inside. A letter. The paper yellowed with age, the handwriting unmistakable. Jonas. The ink was blue, strong, steady, each word spaced with the breath of a man who had written not from impulse, but from resolution, with the weight of one truth that had pushed him beyond the lines of protocol. Era, if you're reading this, I probably didn't keep my promise to return. But you need to know, I didn't choose silence, I chose Sable. Because of everyone who stood between Data and the heart, only he never wavered. He knows when a child is about to stop breathing. He knows how to keep warmth alive just by lying beside it. And above all, he knows that sometimes, what must be done doesn't live in orders. It lives in memory. Era's breath caught. The letter trembled slightly in her grip. I saw him kneel beside DU-01, not because he was told to, but because he was grieving. And in that moment, I wasn't a commanding officer anymore. I was a father who had placed his child in the care of something that knew how to love. At the bottom of the letter, a final line was underlined. If I'm not here, your biometric signal is enough. And just say the words, he has the right to live. Carlton turned toward her, voice low and steady. Era. But she was already moving. She stepped forward, placed her hand against the biometric panel, and said nothing. She simply looked into Sable's eyes. And in that instant, the sensor light turned green. On the control screen, a final line appeared. Signal matched. Jonas, biogenetic heir. Termination protocol, disabled. A distant sound echoed from below. Not a bomb, not machinery, but the hum of the core's secondary power grid halting mid-command. And then, in the top corner of the main display, a symbol flickered into life for the first time in 12 years. Connection established. DU-01. Status. Active. Era reached out, touched the icon. The screen faded. No more text. No alerts. Only a single biosignal chart remained. Steady. Slow. Alive. And beating in time with the breath of a room that, at last, had been freed from the ord. Sable turned its head. Its ears perked up. It didn't growl, didn't whine, only rose to its feet and stepped away from its place, as if a small part of a much longer journey had just been completed. Era followed with her eyes, needing no explanation. She moved behind Sable, through a side corridor, past a narrow slope where Carlton had to steady himself with the railing to keep from losing balance. A steel door came into view at the end of the path, unmarked, without code or label. But as Sable approached, the rusted panel beside it hissed open, revealing an old-style fingerprint scanner, the kind only seen in high-tier physical security systems designed for classified environments. Carlton frowned. This door wasn't in the original architectural schematics. Era didn't respond. She placed her hand on the scanner. A green light activated. The door slid sideways, revealing a chamber so cold it exhaled thin sheets of vapor with every breath, drifting out like mist from something long sealed. Inside was a semicircular room, the floor coated in brushed metal, the walls lined with double-paned glass, reflecting distorted silhouettes of everyone who stepped inside, as if their images were multiplying into some alternate dimension where identity lost shape. At the center, a raised platform held 2 isolation chambers. Small figures lay within, each swaddled in pale gray blankets, marked only with DU-06, stable rhythm, parallel pulse pattern, DU-07, irregular rhythm, deep monitoring required. Era stepped closer. She pressed her fingertips gently to the glass wall of DU-06's unit. The child didn't move. But a faint shimmer on the nearby biosensor flickered, like the warmth of her touch had stirred something that had been frozen too long beneath layers of cryosuspended stillness. Carlton stood silent. These 2 children, they were never logged in any official medical database. He adjusted the scanning light. Beneath the metallic lining at the base of the unit, faint lettering emerged, only visible when the beam struck it at just the right angle. Declared deceased January 1st, 2014, by Internal Order Pulse, removed from National Records Archive. Sable sat beside the glass, not looking at the children, but toward the opposite wall, where a ventilation shaft lay half-concealed, just wide enough for a four-legged creature to slip through. Era followed that gaze. Beneath the grate, a faint pulse of blue light blinked in rhythm, signal trace from the core level. She knelt, flashlight in hand. A cold fluid line ran through the shaft, disappearing downward into a chamber below. No door, no label, but emanating a soft, flickering light from somewhere beneath. Carlton fed the camera cable through the opening, adjusted the angle. The monitor filled with the image of a rounded cryopod, shaped like a long-duration sleep capsule. Inside, another child. Suspended in a translucent biomembrane, hair nearly silver white, eyes open, not blinking, not moving, but watching, as if aware of the watcher. Era took a step back. The last one? Carlton nodded silently. He lifted the panel edge along the pod's rim, revealing an etched identifier, cold-carved by laser. DU-08, unclassified / no birth date / no termination record. Era looked toward Sable, and for the first time since it all began, its eyes narrowed slightly. Not from threat, not from defense, but as if something, buried deep, was being remembered. She whispered, "Did Jonas ever bring him here?" Carlton reached into his coat, pulling out a small, worn USB labeled Creel Core Only. He inserted it into the auxiliary control port on the side of the pod. The screen lit up. A video began playing. No title, no timestamp, just a body cam angle. Crooked, as if recorded hastily from someone's chest. In the footage, a man crouched down, curly hair, wearing an Archvale security uniform, lieutenant insignia glinting faintly. He was speaking softly to a German shepherd in front of him, the light catching the dog's eyes, warm brown, deep and still as a lake at dawn. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but if I don't come back, you know who has to go up first." The dog didn't look away. "And if they try to stop you, you know where to go. The tech sector, frozen zone, double-coded entry." A soft knock. "Just one command, only you can remember." The video cut out. And at that exact moment, the signal light above DU-08's pod shifted from pale green to amber. For the first time, the inscription on the control panel decrypted. Awaiting signal from K913. If received, unlock final tier 0423. Carlton stepped back instinctively. Sable remained still, but its tail lowered, as if every nerve in its body had turned toward a frequency no longer spoken by living things. Era didn't move. In that moment, she no longer heard the wind breathing through conduits, no longer felt the cryo-chill under her skin, only the hollow stillness between heartbeats, where memory returned seconds before it vanished again. She reached for the old device Carlton had retrieved earlier from the engineering satchel. An early-generation drive, still bearing Glenbridge Medical's original registry mark before its control was handed off to the Special Oversight Council. There were 4 directories on the drive. Only one was unprotected. Project Pulse / Internal Operational Records / Restricted Circulation. Carlton stared at the monitor, fingertips brushing the side of the sensor pad, just enough for the blue LED to glint over his collar, now stained faintly with dried blood. Era clicked open the folder. Inside were dozens of files, mostly internal emails, financial audits, encrypted board transcripts, but 3 files were flagged. Urgent. Do not transfer off network. She opened the first. From Elston, Carey, Director of Clinical Biogenics, to Pulse Governance Council. Group code, Scepter. All death certificates will uniformly cite unspecified neonatal complications. Blood samples have been relabeled and rerouted to the New Hampshire Medical Vault under a Shell Hospital ID. Sable, K9 is no longer listed as an active subject, but I request that no one interfere until we confirm full biological empathy synchronization with DU01 Carlton swallowed. They knew about all the ones. Still alive. Era nodded slowly. Then, without a word, she opened the second file. It was a scanned contract. The signatures were clear. Biomedical Council Number 7/Financial Proxy. Hallcrest Private Holdings. Clause 4 stood out more than any other. No use of public funding, no affiliation with federal research grants, no mention permitted in national medical reports. Carlton furrowed his brow. Hallcrest, that's a shell company. They handle asset liquidation after hospital closures, but they've also appeared in disappearance reports in 3 northern states. Era moved on. She opened the third file. It was a transcript of a closed-door meeting. No names, just placeholders. A 1 to A5. One excerpt was marked in red. The goal is not to preserve life. It is to test the viability of existence without emotional development. If a child has never heard a mother's voice, will they respond to another's death? And if a dog, an animal never trained to mourn, chooses to lie beside the weakest child, is that biological response? Or something more? Carlton exhaled, almost in disbelief. They weren't guessing. They were testing the outermost edge of human existence. Era stood. She left the console behind and walked toward the end of the room, where Sable still sat silently, the floor lamp casting a slanted glow across his back, a gentle curve of warmth against the invisible chill that clung to everything they were uncovering. She lowered herself beside him, not touching, not calling, just whispering, almost to herself. They cleared the papers, but you kept the path. Sable didn't move, but from the corner of his eye, or perhaps from the ceiling, damp and shadowed, a single drop of water fell, landing perfectly between his front paws, as if the room itself had wept quietly for everything it had once tried to forget. Carlton turned back to the screen. He opened a subfolder. Financial Records, December 2011. The ledger appeared. It included morgue operation costs, damages from a pneumatic gas incident, and then a line that didn't belong. Compensation, missing personnel, Jonas Creel, no body recovered. Record code C-013X. At the very bottom, a handwritten note. This expense is not to appear in official reports. All responses regarding Jonas must read, "No remains found." Era froze. She turned to Carlton, pointing at the code. That's my father's handwriting. But this last line, there's an extra pen stroke. It's been altered. She zoomed in. A faint streak of pale blue ink, almost faded into the page, appeared beneath the printed text. If you're reading this line, don't believe every door has been closed. Carlton fell silent. And then, from the auxiliary speaker, a soft static crackled through, not an alarm, not a security code, but the warped sound of an old radio signal being pulled off frequency. Era leaned in. A new message began to type itself across the screen. Below level F. There is a segment not marked on any map. We hit it. for those who were never given names. Carlton immediately dispatched an internal order. Within 3 minutes, a tech team responded. An anomalous magnetic reading was found behind a section of wall on level F. The floor tiles gave a hollow sound when tapped. No cuts, no access ducts, no electrical marks, no logical reason for it to be there. They moved quickly. Sable led. No sound, no hesitation, no command needed. He walked, direct, measured, certain. Era knelt, pressing her ear against the wall. Behind the thick concrete, a sound, so faint, so fragile, it barely existed, like a breath trapped between 2 winters, held in a blanket no one ever meant to unfold. Carlton activated the scanner. An electromagnetic pulse swept through. The wall responded. Not like a door opening, but like layers retreating, quiet, heavy, slow, until light from the corridor flooded into a room frozen in stillness. A square chamber, white walls, high ceiling, 6 small beds, spaced evenly apart. No pillows, no wires, no biometric monitors. Only one object hung on the wall. A large photograph of a snow-covered mountain range with a trail of single footsteps stretching toward a rising sun. And beneath it, a line of handwritten text, shaky and uneven. We are not born to feel. We are born to learn how to keep what we feel. Era stood at the center of the room. She looked at the beds. Blank, nameless, untouched. And then, from her pocket, she took a photo. Old, sepia-toned with age, but the faces were unmistakable. Jonas, half smiling, his hand resting gently on Sable's neck, both standing on snow-covered ground, with Ridgepine Ridge behind them. A place known only to those who had once lived in the town. A place where no signposts had ever been nailed into the frozen earth. Era placed the photo beside the large image. No nails, no frame, just the edge tucked into the border and a single step back. "It begins here," she said softly. "They will be named from this point forward." Carlton nodded quietly. He opened the audio log recorder. "First name?" Era lifted her gaze toward Sable. The dog lay beside the center bed. His ears were relaxed, his breathing steady, his eyes closed, not from exhaustion, not from alertness, but from a peace no one had seen him reach in over a decade. The girl found first, DU-01. I'll name her Arlen. Carlton entered the name. "And the boy from chamber DU-08? Era didn't turn. She stared at the wall, where a faint light was spilling through the gap in the maintenance panel. "I want to keep the name Jonas wrote. No changes." Carlton paused. "That means—" Era nodded gently. That child was never an experiment. He was the part of someone that the system never allowed to be acknowledged. Someone who once chose to walk away from it all. The door to level F was closing behind them. Outside, federal patrol vehicles had lined up along the hospital's main corridor. The tactical team had entered. Internal affairs officers began recording formal closure procedures for the entire South Wing. The list of arrests stretched across 2 pages. Carrie Elston, the supervising biologists, 3 members of the funding council, and 2 federal medical advisors who had remained anonymously embedded within the framework of Project Pulse. Carlton stepped forward. "You don't need to be at the press conference. Let me handle the ministry." Era shook her head. "Number, I want to speak, but not about the program. I want to speak about the children who never had birthdays." Sable still lay still. No motion. But something in the rhythm of its breath softened the air in the room, as if all the alarms, the red system errors, The biometric scans that triggered every time someone stepped beyond a boundary had finally gone quiet. There was only breath now. As though everything that had endured for more than a decade had, at last, found a place to be set down. Not erased, not forgotten, just released. Era knelt, gently resting her hand on Sable's graying coat. She didn't call his name, didn't whisper comfort. She just left her hand there. And while Carlton turned to check the digital chain of custody for the files being transferred to federal archives, a new alert flashed on Era's handheld monitor. Core Tier Taicho Auxiliary Access reactivated. Timestamp 426. She looked up, her gaze moving through the frosted glass that led to the main corridor, where the first light of day had begun to stretch its way down the hallway, casting long, golden slants between each frame of the windows. It was a soft light, but warm. As if after all those years of cold and hidden silence, the world had found its way back, through the most ordinary doorway of all. Sunlight. No one gave a command, no one spoke, but the steps began to move of their own accord. Carlton walked first. Era followed. And at the end of the corridor, the security response team stood waiting, a schematic already unrolled. This time with no red alert, no special access codes, only a small line of text. Western Subgate, reactivated via K9 biometric trigger. The door opened. Beyond it was a tunnel leading deep into the stone, originally built as a technical quarantine zone, long decommissioned in 2012 after the Ridgepine landslide sealed off half the district. No one said anything more. But everyone understood. This tunnel didn't lead to a storage unit. It led to the final part of a truth Jonas never had the chance to open. 1 week later, at the memorial site behind the hospital, there were no loudspeakers, no speakers at a podium, no engraved plaques. Only a single white stone placed at the foot of the hill, where the grass still bore the prints of 6 small sets of feet running across that morning. 2 lines were carved into the stone. Jonas Creel, 1968, was 2011 Sable, K9 13, 2009, 2025. You kept the vow no one else could. No one knew who carved it. Carlton said it wasn't him. Era shook her head. But everyone understood. It hadn't come from any official order. It had come from memory. Sable was buried beside Jonas, beneath the only pine tree that had survived the fire of 2018. And strangely, during the entire ceremony, not a single child cried. Not because they didn't feel, but because they were listening in their own way. 3 months passed. The 6 children, those whose codes bore DU from 01 to 07, were now under care at a private recovery center, with glass walls facing a still lake where birds returned seasonally. Under Era's guidance and the new specialist team, each child had begun to sit up, to reach toward the sunlight streaming in through the windows, and to smile. Not because someone made them laugh, but because they finally felt safe enough to. Some still hadn't spoken. Some still couldn't walk without wobbling. But all of them had learned one thing. The first name they remembered wasn't Dad, wasn't Mom. It was Sable, the name they whispered whenever their hands touched the wooden dog figure placed in the center of the room, right where the morning light was warmest. Carlton stood behind the glass, watching. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for one person to hear. Maybe this is how Jonas wanted them to be remembered, not by their files, not by their ID codes, but by their gaze, by their instinct, by something that didn't need to be taught to be kept. Era stood beside him. In her hand was the old field notebook Jonas had carried, the final page still intact, the handwriting unshaken. If no one is left to speak, let a dog keep the vow. That night, long after lights had gone out. After all, 6 children had fallen asleep in the arms of someone, not quite their mother, but someone who stayed longer than anyone ever had. The basement camera system blinked back to life. No one had touched it. No one had sent a signal. But a new connection registered through the internal channel, core level, auxiliary. The route marked no map available. And on the secondary monitor in the security room, for the very first time, an image appeared. A man, dressed in an old technician's uniform, face blurred, holding a biometric scanner, standing in the middle of a room that had never been seen before, where a slanted sign hung over the door. Reserve, do not open, unless the dog comes first. In a snow-covered land where time drifts slowly between pine trees and a quiet wooden porch, Kala lived among memories too tender to speak aloud. Until one still morning, a shivering puppy appeared at the fence, soaked, silent, yet with eyes that seemed to reach deep into her. From that moment on, her steps began to move toward the forest, where something long buried waited to be found. Where did Pharaoh lead Kala? And what truth lies beneath that silent blanket of snow? North Hollow had entered its 6th white season. The wooden roads winding around the hills no longer bore any trace of tires. The old pines bowed like sleepy sentinels, quietly shielding the scattered wooden houses in the valley from the wind. Snow blanketed the rooftops like thick, sugared cream, gleaming where the sun struggled to peek through the misted sky. In the stillness typical of high mountain towns, only the occasional call of a lost forest bird or the gentle brushing of wind across glass, like a hand reaching out, could be heard. Kala's small cabin stood at the end of a slope that descended into the woods, where the sun always arrived a heartbeat later than anywhere else. Its walls were dark, stained wood, the roof slanted just enough to shed snow, and the front window opened to a patch of land as untouched as a blank sheet of paper. Though wrapped in thick pine logs and kept warm by a constant fire in the stove, the house still held a quietness that felt suspended, as if someone had once spoken here, often and with joy, only to fall silent all at once. And since then, no one dared raise their voice again. Kala moved as if afraid of shattering that silence. Her tiny fur slippers whispered against the wooden floor as she turned down the hallway. Her face was small, her eyes long and gently lowered, as if always carrying a question no one had answered. Every morning, upon waking, she would walk to the window in front of the living room, where her father used to hang a map of bird species, and stare out over the valley. Not searching, just standing there, maybe waiting for something to happen, or for someone to come home. 1 year ago, a wildfire swept down from the west. It took only 3 hours for the hills behind the town to turn into ash. Kala had stood on the porch when her mother screamed into the phone, her voice merging with the howling wind. Still no contact with Captain Spencer. That was her father's name. After that day, Kala stopped saying anyone's name. No one blamed her. Neighbors still stopped by sometimes, placing cookie tins on the porch with red-taped notes that read, "For Kala." A few asked Rowan, Kala's mother, whether she needed a new therapist for the girl. Rowan would smile, say thank you, and return to her shifts at the clinic. At first, Rowan tried everything to coax words out of her daughter. She played old videos, brought back photo albums, hung drawings all over the room. But eventually, she stopped trying to force it. She let silence settle in like a part of daily life. Instead of pushing, Rowan left small notes on the fridge each morning. I left sweet potato soup under the cast iron lid, sliced breads in the tin box. "I'll be home late tonight, but the porch light is always yours." "It's snowing today. Dress warm if you're heading out, my brave girl." No one ever replied to those notes, but by the next morning a slice of bread would be missing, or a scarf would be neatly hung back on its hook. That was how Kala said. I read. I understand. I'm still here. The window seat beside the fireplace was where Kala spent most of her time. She had a fur pillow tucked on the sill, a blanket around her shoulders, and a little blank notebook on her lap. Sometimes she picked up a colored pencil and scribbled nameless swirls. Other times she simply watched the endless white beyond the glass, waiting, perhaps, for the faintest movement from a place no one else dared to look. The living room was warm and still. The fire crackled under dry pine wood. On the high shelf sat a family photo. Kala in the middle, cheeks flushed with sunlight. Her father, Fire Captain Spencer, grinning wide, arms wrapped around his wife and daughter. Beneath it was an old radio that hadn't worked in ages, but Kala never let her mother put it away. Maybe, somewhere in her mind, the static would come back if her father ever needed to reach them. Whenever her mother came home, Kala would quietly set her slippers by the door. No one taught her that. She had once seen her father do it when Rowan was sick with a fever, and the look in his eyes that night stayed with her. Gestures without words, sometimes warmer than anything spoken aloud. They lived together, Rowan and Kala, like two companions under the same roof, each guarding a world of their own, yet still touching across quiet gestures. A folded scarf, a reheated soup, a window left slightly ajar to let light in despite the cold. From afar, North Hollow looked like a painting in gray and white. But from Kala's window, the snow took on a different color each evening, sometimes a soft orange glow, sometimes a deep purple hue like the worn jackets of firemen. Once, Rowan caught sight of Kala drawing quietly with wax crayons. There were no people in the picture. Just a house, a small fire, and 3 round shadows near a window. Perhaps they were her mother, and someone else, unseen, undefined. Kala didn't explain. Rowan didn't ask. But that night, before bed, she gently brushed her daughter's hair and whispered, "If one day you want to speak, I'll listen. If not yet, I'll still be here." Kala didn't answer. But as her mother turned away, she quietly pulled the thick blanket up to her chin, hugging the worn-out teddy bear that had been her 6th birthday gift, the last one her father ever gave her. That night, snow continued to fall. The fire kept burning. And Kala remained by the window, her gaze distant, as if waiting for something that was just on the verge of changing. Mornings in North Hollow never arrived with alarm clocks. No traffic, no voices calling, only the faint patter of snow on rooftops, like someone sprinkling flour over a wooden table. The light outside was just enough to make out shapes, but not yet enough to sharpen them, casting the world in a soft silver hue, like something just awakened from a cold dream. Rowan pushed back the blanket and slipped her arms into a thick coat without turning on the lights. She had long learned to do everything in silence, as though a noise too loud might cause her daughter to shrink like a small bird startled from its nest. Breakfast was simple: a bowl of oatmeal simmered in milk, a single slice of golden toast, and a thermos of vegetable soup left warming on the stove. Next to the honey jar, she stuck a small note. "I'm on shift until evening. Remember to light the stove at 4. It'll get colder. It's okay if you don't eat much, but share it with Pharaoh if he comes back." Rowan didn't wait for Kala to come out of her room. She slipped on her coat, slung her medical bag over her shoulder, and gently closed the door behind her. Each step she took down the snow-covered path left deep indents, footprints that stitched a thread between 2 quiet worlds. One leaving, one staying. Calla stood in the soft morning light at the window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a second skin. Her mother was gone, like every morning. But today, the wind blew stronger, the snow fell heavier, and something in the air made her stand there longer than usual. It wasn't the cold. It was the rhythm of the falling snow, familiar yet different, as if touching something old that had never truly disappeared. Outside, the snowfall made no sound, but as it passed through the tall pines, the wind stirred it into spirals, letting flakes drop like silver feathers. Calla watched each one fall without blinking. In her eyes, something ancient stirred, not a memory, but a feeling. She turned away and walked to the cabinet. From the second drawer, she pulled out a neatly folded red scarf. Inside it was an old tin box. When opened, it revealed only 3 items: a dull brass rescue whistle, a frayed cotton wrist strap, and a small black patch embroidered with a flame, the personal emblem of Captain Spencer. Her father used to hang that patch outside the rescue tent on every mission. To Calla, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a banner of belief. Whenever she saw it, she knew he was still safe. A sharp gust suddenly whistled through the window crack. The sound swept Calla back to a long-ago afternoon, the last before everything changed. The wind had been strong that day, too. They stood on the front steps. Calla clutched her fabric backpack with the fox on it. Her father wore his uniform, the bright orange-red jacket standing out against the gray sky. His face was flushed from the cold, but his eyes were just as warm as always. He knelt down and rested his hand gently on her head. "I'll be back before sunset today. We've still got that book in the toy box to finish, remember?" Calla nodded. She didn't smile, but her eyes curved ever so slightly, a signal only her father understood as her way of smiling when shy. He lifted a hand and gave a short, sharp whistle. The sound drifted into the icy air like a ribbon of smoke. It was his way of saying goodbye, his unspoken promise to return. But that afternoon, the whistle never came again. Calla clutched the tin box to her chest and sat by the fireplace. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only closed her eyes and imagined that sound, the soft tone of a brass whistle, small but echoing far into the forest. In her memory, it had never stopped. It was still out there, waiting for someone to hear it. The fire crackled softly. A piece of wood split near the base, revealing grain lines that curved like a slanted smile. Calla placed the tin box back on the shelf, then returned to the window. She gently unlatched it, opening just enough space for the wind to slip in. The cold air rushed in, turning her nose red and painting her cheeks pink like someone caught in a blush. But Calla didn't close the window. She wanted the wind to carry something out, or maybe bring something back. The snow kept falling. Silently. But through Calla's eyes, it was no longer just snow. It was a whisper, a river of memory. Footsteps once made across a white world. Faded, yet never erased. She rested her chin on the window cushion, her eyes following the path where her mother had walked that morning. In the stillness, she imagined the footprints, each one as if they were still there. And then, Calla pressed her palm gently against the glass, letting her hand touch the cold outside. It had been a long time since she'd reached out to the world in a way that felt this real. The wind blew, soft but true. It slipped through the crack in the window and danced across the fine strands of hair falling across her forehead. In that moment, even just for a breath, Calla felt as if someone had just passed by. The snow continued falling, soft and steady, covering everything like a seamless white cloth. The sky had faded into gray, but it hadn't turned gloomy. It was simply the kind of hue that blurred everything together, so nothing beyond the window had distinct form anymore. Not the trees, not the snow, not even the weather. Worn fence at the edge of the yard. Calla stayed by the windowsill, chin resting on her knees, arms wrapped around her legs like she did every afternoon when her mother was away. Her eyes quietly traced the movement of the snowflakes, as if she were counting how many unsaid things might be buried beneath the growing white. And then, something in her breath hesitated. At the edge of the fence, where the snow usually spread evenly, a dark spot appeared, a blotch of golden brown, speckled like ink bleeding across wet paper. At first, Calla thought she was imagining it. She blinked, sat upright, and pressed her face closer to the glass. This time there was no mistaking it. A creature, small, thin, lying motionless. The snow fell onto its back but didn't settle evenly. Some patches had soaked into the fur, clumping together, frozen stiff. Its legs were tucked in, head drooped low, and its belly rose and fell so faintly it was nearly invisible unless one looked hard. A puppy. Calla didn't know why she shot to her feet. Only that her heart began to race, like someone had flipped a switch inside her chest. The blanket slipped from her shoulders. She didn't bother picking it up. She ran to the coat rack, grabbing the thick fur-lined jacket her mother kept for sudden snowstorms. The rubber boots were still crooked by the doorway. She didn't pause. Slipped them on, fumbled the collar up to her chin, and pushed the door open. The wind slapped her face, stinging cold like it could tear skin. But Calla didn't back away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fence. Step by step, she trudged through snow that reached her knees. Her hands were tucked deep into her sleeves, yet still trembled. Not from fear, but because for the first time in over a year, she wasn't standing behind the glass anymore. For the first time, she stepped out of the place she'd hidden in for too long. As she got closer, the image became clearer. A pale golden puppy, drenched through, eyes shut tight. But when Calla knelt down and reached out toward the snow beside it, the little creature flinched. It didn't run. It only opened its eyes slightly, two round black beads like buttons, filled with fear. Not pain, but a deeper fear of being left behind. A fear Calla knew too well. She didn't speak, but her lips formed a single word, silent, yet her breath shaped a faint wisp in the cold air. "It's okay." She shrugged off the coat and wrapped the tiny body inside, lifting it with both arms. Its fur was stiff with ice, like a wet cotton ball forgotten in the freezer. Its body felt strangely light, not like a healthy pup, but more like a soaked towel, barely heavy enough to feel real. Calla turned and made her way back, step by careful step. The wind picked up, tossing snow down her collar. But her arms tightened, holding the fragile bundle close to her chest, like protecting a flicker of warmth just born in a winter that had lasted too long. Inside, the fireplace still burned. Calla laid the creature on the thick rug, nearest to the heat. She reached into the laundry basket where her mother kept towels and began gently wiping the matted fur. Each time she touched it, the pup shivered, but didn't pull away. As if the warmth, so foreign and sudden, had left it unsure how to respond. It only lay still, blinking slowly. Calla didn't stop. Her hands reddened from the cold, but her eyes were wide open, no longer clouded by the months of gray that had dulled them. Something in her face was shifting. A light, small but steady, had begun to glow at the bottom of her gaze. She pulled the old blanket from the sofa, wrapped it snugly around the pup, and placed a bowl of warm water nearby. Every movement was soft, deliberate, as if one wrong touch could break something too delicate to fix. The pup opened its eyes again. Its mouth twitched slightly. not enough to tell whether it was exhaustion or a try at gratitude. But Calla understood in her own way. She smiled, not big, just a slight curve of her lips, enough to show that something inside had changed. Pharaoh. For the first time in over 300 days, a sound came out, not loud, but a voice. She spoke the puppy's name, not knowing why it was that name. Maybe from an old storybook, maybe from a corner of memory she couldn't place anymore. The pup didn't respond, but its eyes opened wider, and in them, there was life. Calla sat beside the fire, her hands cupped together on her knees. Pharaoh nestled deeper into the blanket, eyes fluttering closed. The room felt brighter, even as the sky outside dimmed. The snow kept falling. But for the first time, Calla didn't look out the window anymore. She looked at Pharaoh, in silence, and let the firelight bathe her brown hair, her small face, and the eyes that, for the first time, stopped searching the past. Pharaoh lay still, his tiny chest rising and falling so faintly it looked like ripples trapped beneath a frozen lake. His fur, once soaked through, had dried somewhat under the cotton towel, but the cold that had seeped into his flesh from the snow hadn't yet left him completely. Calla sat beside him, bent toward the fireplace as if trying to pull the flames closer to the small body beside her. She opened her palms above the fire for a few seconds, then gently pressed one to Pharaoh's back, just like her mother used to do for her on nights of high fever, when no medicine worked better than the warmth of a hand still alive with heat. Pharaoh's body trembled slightly. Each breath was shallow, uneven, yet stubbornly ongoing. He didn't whimper, didn't cry, didn't resist. He simply stayed curled up, eyes shut, and his fragile body tilted ever so slightly toward Calla, as if in a world so cold and unknown, the only real place left was this small corner of the fire, and the quiet figure sitting beside it. Calla stood, pulled a second towel from the wooden basket in the corner, soaked it in warm water from the thermos her mother had left, and wrung it just enough so that it still held its heat. She laid it across Pharaoh's chest, and held it there, her hand steady, not trembling, not rushed. In the glow of firelight brushing against her cheeks, Calla no longer looked like a child, not because of her size or actions, but because of the strange calm in her every movement. No one had taught her how to do this. She just remembered. Last winter, when her father returned with an injured hand after breaking through a wall to save someone, her mother had done the same, pressed a warm towel and held it there in silence. The heat hadn't come from the cloth. It came from the hand. And Calla knew Pharaoh needed exactly that. The puppy shivered, not violently but rhythmically. Each little flinch felt like a dream trying to anchor itself before it faded. Calla said nothing, but her eyes never looked away, not even for a second. On the table, the colored pencil still rested beside the blank sketchbook. Calla didn't touch them. Her hands were busy pouring warm water into a small bowl, breaking apart a piece of dry bread from the tin her mother kept, letting it soak until it softened. Pharaoh was too weak to eat. But when she brought a small wooden spoon close to his nose, the puppy sniffed, barely, and then gave the spoon's edge a faint lick, as if offering up the last of his strength to this moment. Calla smiled faintly. No sound, no wide grin, just the kind of brightness that slipped quietly into her eyes, like the first star appearing after a long gray storm. She placed her hand gently on Pharaoh's head, tracing one slow line from his forehead down the bridge of his nose. The pup didn't flinch. His eyes opened slightly, for the first time, meeting Calla's fully. No fear, no wariness, just a still, deep gaze, dark and wide, like a sky holding its breath. That eye contact startled Calla. She straightened, her lips parting softly as if testing whether she could still shape the name that had echoed in her mind since she saw him by the fence. Faro. No sound came out, but the shape of the word was clear. Light, hesitant, almost like it had waited in her chest for too long and had finally found its way out. The dog kept looking at her. Kala placed her hand on her own chest, then pointed gently toward him. Faro. She mouthed it again, clearer this time, just like how her mother had once taught her to pronounce letters on the wooden board stuck to their fridge. Faro blinked. Nothing dramatic followed. No wagging tail, no bark of joy. But Kala understood. The name had been received. She smiled, nodded, not to herself, but to the life that had just been given its first name. Outside, the wind softened. The snow on the rooftop settled into a smooth layer, like a blanket finally spread after a night of restless turns. Kala added another towel, tucking it securely around Faro's body. The firelight reached out across the wooden wall, and for the first time, the room no longer wore its old colors. There was something new now, not a grand change, just a subtle shift, because in that room, there was now one more breath, a new breath, gentle, real. Kala didn't nap that afternoon as she usually did. She leaned against the sofa, eyes still on Faro. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't think about what she had lost. She didn't look toward the framed photo on the shelf, didn't replay the sound of the rescue whistle. In her mind now, there was only one image, a small creature curled up, back rising with each breath, and with every breath, something within her thawed just a little more, like the warmth of the fire seeping back into a heart that had spent too long frozen by a winter no words could describe. The fire still burned bright. Outside, the wind brushed across the roof, scattering snowflakes down along the porch like invisible fingers stroking across the shingles. Inside, Kala remained in her place, where she'd been for hours, on the wooden floor by the rug beside Faro. And though the puppy had been dried, wrapped, warmed, and given water, Faro still refused to close his eyes. Faro didn't whimper. He didn't bark. He just watched. Those small eyes weren't watching Kala. They were fixed on the door. There was nothing frantic or urgent in Faro's gaze, yet it carried something unmistakable, as if what he was focused on wasn't the world outside, but something deeper echoing within him. A silent call, a pull in a direction even he couldn't explain. Kala leaned down, gently touched Faro's front leg, and gave it a light squeeze, as if to ask, "Why aren't you sleeping?" Faro didn't pull away, but he didn't turn to her either. His round, dark eyes remained locked on the rough wooden door, where a streak of snow clung to the bottom like an uneven brushstroke. That door, it hadn't been opened from the inside in a very long time. Kala drew in a slow breath. This time, the warmth she felt wasn't from the fire. It was something swelling inside her chest, a quiet realization that Faro hadn't come here just to be saved. He had come with something unfinished, something still waiting. The look in his eyes wasn't one of seeking shelter. It was the look of someone about to lead the way. Kala stepped toward the window. Before, she'd looked at the snow as if staring into memory, but now she looked in the direction Faro had been watching. Through the glass, the sky had turned to ash gray, and the snowfall was softer, the air outside seeming less harsh than it had been hours ago. She turned back. Faro had propped himself up on his front paws, still bundled in the blanket, but with his head lifted, his eyes never leaving the door. Kala said nothing, but something had shifted in her gaze. It wasn't just observation anymore. It was connection, understanding. Pharaoh couldn't speak, but Kala was already used to a world without words. And in that silence, they heard each other more clearly than anything spoken aloud. She pulled out the forest green fleece coat from the closet, her mother's, long, thick, down to her knees. She slipped her arms through the sleeves like putting on a memory. The last time she'd worn it was 2 winters ago, when she and her mother still went on Sunday morning walks. Back then, the snow hadn't come so heavily, and Kala's heart hadn't yet frozen from loss. She zipped the coat up to her chin, wrapped the wool scarf around her neck 3 times, carefully, without rushing. Then she crouched down and gently placed her hand on Pharaoh's head. "Let's go." No sound came out, but the shape of her lips was clear, like pale breath drifting across a barely opened door. Pharaoh pushed up immediately, wobbling slightly. The blanket fell away, revealing his thin frame, but his eyes, those eyes, were brighter than any other part of him. He gave a small shake, then dragged himself toward the door. Kala followed, her hand resting on the latch. The last time that door had opened from within was when her father had still been alive, leaving for the woods early in the morning for a rescue mission. That day, she had stood in the doorway, watching his orange coat disappear into the trees. When the door closed, the world had folded in, shrinking down to sticky notes and a window frame. But today, her small hand found its way to the latch once more. Click. The door opened, wind rushing in, just as cold as always. But Kala didn't flinch. Pharaoh stood waiting on the threshold, his front paws sunk into the snow but braced with determination. No command, no whistle, but they both understood. They stepped out together. The snow lay smooth and even, but their fresh footprints cut a path that stretched toward the dark pine woods beyond. Pharaoh led, each step shaking slightly but steady. Kala followed close behind, clutching her scarf to keep it from slipping loose. And just before the door closed behind them, she turned for a moment. Not to look at the house, but to glance back at the fire still glowing inside, as if to say warmth would still be waiting. Then she turned forward again, her eyes on Pharaoh, her lips mouthing once more, clearer than before. "Lead the way." The snow reached the edge of her boots. The pine forest behind the cabin had never seemed frightening, at least not in Kala's memories. But today, with the wind weaving through the trunks and thick frost masking every rough layer of bark, the forest suddenly felt like a path not made for people. Pharaoh walked ahead, each small step planted with purpose. The fur on his belly still clung together in wet clumps, his legs trembling slightly with every plunge into deep snow, but his gaze never wavered. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. Pharaoh didn't guide like a dog that knew the way. He moved like someone chasing a piece of memory buried beneath the wind. Kala followed, fists gripping the edge of her coat, her scarf, so neatly wrapped, now damp around the edges. Every time the wind swept across her face, her cheeks stung with cold. But she didn't turn around, didn't call out for Pharaoh to stop. Her steps followed his, her breath sinking with the gusts, as if her body were relearning how to exist in this world, inch by inch, breath by breath. The path through the forest had long faded, but the shapes of the pine trees still looked the same as they had when she was smaller, when her father led her through these woods in search of the first red pine of the season. That day, there had been no snow. He held her hand the entire way, telling stories about squirrels leaping between the highest branches. His voice had been low but gentle, each word leaving behind a warmth she didn't know she'd one day need. She still remembered the moment her father paused, crouched down, and whispered, "You know, not every place in the forest is scary. But there are places no one wants to go, and it's exactly there that something most worth finding is often hidden. Calla didn't answer then. She had been too young to understand. But now, deep in the forest where wind and snow swallowed every sound, following the small creature with eyes that trembled yet held firm, she began to understand what her father had meant. The deeper they went, the denser the trees became, the higher the snow rose. Every so often Faro would stop, ears perked, head tilted toward sounds that Calla couldn't hear. Each time, she halted too, waiting in silence. No rush. Faro would sniff the air softly, then carry on. The line between fear and instinct slowly blurred. Calla didn't know whether she was scared or simply being pulled by something stronger than fear, like a quiet current beneath frozen water. She didn't feel lost. She didn't feel unsure. Farther from home than she'd ever been, she felt clearer, as if each step brushed away another layer of fog clouding her mind. Each step, a piece of something she had tried not to remember. Wind hissed through the treetops. A few dry branches cracked and fell, snapping lightly against the snow. Calla curled her hands tighter inside her sleeves, the cold creeping all the way up to her shoulders. But Faro didn't stop, and neither did she. They crossed a shallow dip in the land, where the wind thickened the air into something that felt heavier, harder to breathe. Faro suddenly froze, his body tensed, not in fear but in alertness, ears upright, body lowered, nose pointed straight ahead. Calla took one more step forward, but Faro turned toward her, eyes locking onto hers as if to say, "Stop here." She understood. No voice. Just trust. Faro moved ahead a few paces, lowered his nose to the snow. The wind shifted, carrying something faint. Damp fur, the stale tang of blood dried and lost in snow. Faro let out a low bark. Not loud, not drawn out, but just enough for Calla to hear. A sound that was both a warning and an invitation. Calla drew in a deep breath. She knew something waited just ahead. Not danger, but something Faro couldn't face alone. Something that, even if she didn't yet understand, she somehow knew she needed to witness. She stepped forward beside him, her eyes tracing the line where Faro had barked. Between the snow-covered trunks, one patch of snow looked sunken. Not obviously, but just enough to feel wrong. Faro moved toward it slowly, as though afraid he might disturb something sacred beneath. Calla held her breath. She still couldn't see anything, but her heartbeat had changed. Something was waiting. And Faro, his round black eyes full of something too deep to name, turned back to look at her once more. This time there was no fear in them, only hope. A flicker of hope blurred by the wind, yet unmistakably bright, like the final light flickering across an endless sea of white. Faro moved forward, not rushing, not leaping, but step by step, as if afraid that pressing too hard might shatter whatever fragile truth lay beneath the snowy veil, like a thin layer of ice atop a mirror. Calla followed, her eyes fixed on the faint hollow in the whiteness, where the wind no longer raced but drifted quietly between the leaning pines like breath beneath the eaves of an old roof. Beneath a gently bowed canopy, shielded from the wind by thick tree trunks, a dark form lay curled. Only as Calla came closer did it become clear. It wasn't stone, nor some object buried in the snow. It was fur, matted, dark, clumped together from dampness and hardened by the freeze. Brisa. No one said her name, but they both knew. Faro had reached her, eyes unblinking, and when he stopped, he simply sat, staring at the unmoving shape in front of him. She was more than twice his size, her body curled tightly as if trying to shield the injury from the cold. But snow couldn't mask the scent. Calla froze in place. The smell of dried blood, sharp and metallic, thick like the scent of hospital gauze her mother used to hide after every emergency shift. One of Brisa's hind legs was caked in frozen red, wounded by teeth or rock or something else Calla couldn't tell, but the fur around it had torn, exposing swollen, purplish skin bruised by cold. Pharaoh didn't bark. He let out a faint whine, then lowered his head, touching his nose to Brisa's cheek. A single touch, as if to say, "I've come back. Don't be afraid. I'm here." Brisa stirred, barely, just enough for Calla to see her chest rise and fall ever so slightly, shallow and slow like a dry leaf landing on a frozen lake. Calla didn't move right away. It was as if she feared that one breath, one shift, might cause this fragile moment to vanish, just like her father had, lost in the break of a single sound between the burning trees. But then, driven by something instinctive, she slowly knelt. Snow seeped into her knees, biting cold. Her hands trembled, not from the frost, but from the sheer fragility of what lay before her. Brisa didn't open her eyes, but her breath was still there. Pharaoh nestled into her chest, burying his head beneath her chin, as if trying to tuck the warmth back into her body, one shiver at a time. Calla raised her hand. Slowly, so slowly, each fingertip tinged with snow, swollen from the cold, but she didn't pull back. She placed her hand gently on Brisa's uninjured side, pressing her palm down softly. Her fur was stiff, frozen solid, but beneath that, there was life, weak but present. Calla didn't speak. She simply lowered her head. Her hair fell forward, catching the cold air like strands dipped in fog. Her small hand remained on Brisa's back, and there, after so long, she remembered something she had forgotten, the feel of a fading life still waiting to be touched, not to be saved, but simply not to be left alone. Pharaoh whimpered now and then, ears folded back, his body tight with worry. But when Brisa moved again, just a small tilt of her head, Pharaoh lifted his face, eyes locked, as though waiting for a miracle. No miracle came. But the way Brisa cracked her eyes open, just barely, and looked toward Pharaoh, that was enough. Pharaoh exhaled sharply, as though something had reignited inside the tiny furnace of his chest. Calla reached for the wound. Not directly, but with a soft cloth scarf she unwound from her neck. She dabbed it gently, not to clean, but to see. To see clearly that this injury couldn't be left for another hour. It couldn't stay here. The wind had eased, but the cold lingered like a shadow. Calla glanced around. No one, just her, Pharaoh, and Brisa. But oddly, she didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel lost. Her heart, once silenced, once emptied of dreams and belief, now beat in rhythm with another fragile life. Calla leaned down, resting her forehead against Brisa's, a touch so soft it barely disturbed the frost. She didn't know why she did it, only that she had to, like a whispered promise not made of words. "I won't leave you behind." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft as broken dreams drifting down to blanket everything that still needed to be held. As Calla tightened the ends of the scarf, slipping them gently beneath Brisa's chest, she didn't imagine herself doing anything heroic. She just knew she couldn't leave Brisa lying there under the pines, where the wind stung like steel and the snow kept falling over breath too quiet to be heard. Brisa was heavy. Even weakened, even emaciated, the body of a full-grown German shepherd was like a living stone, warm, scarred, and unyielding. Calla couldn't carry her, but she could pull, at least try. She gripped the knotted ends of the scarf, planted her feet, leaned back to create leverage. The snow resisted. Each drag barely gained 2 hand widths, but she did it again. And again. The ground was uneven. Beneath the snow were roots, rocks, and frozen hollows. Every step felt like sinking into a whispered voice that said, "Give up." But she kept pulling. The wind didn't howl, but it slipped beneath the scarf, biting at the back of her neck, lifting the baby hairs there until they stood. Each breath she exhaled became a thin mist that vanished just beyond her face. She could no longer feel her fingertips. Her gloves were soaked, the cold water pressing through the fabric, freezing against her palms like tiny shards of salt. Faro walked beside her. The little dog didn't make a sound, didn't try to run ahead or bark like in the movies. He just stayed by her side, each trembling step matching hers, as if he too understood that this was a battle fought in silence. A quiet fight, but one filled with effort. His eyes stayed on Calla. There was something in that look, not fear, not just hope, but trust. Faro didn't know why Calla was dragging his mother, but he understood one thing. No one else could do this but her. Each meter passed like an hour. Calla's back ached. Her knees burned from striking hidden stones beneath the snow. Once, her foot slipped and she fell face first into the cold. But she didn't cry. Not because she was strong, but because she had no energy left to cry. Her eyes stung from the wind, from snow flung straight into her face, yet she still lifted her head and looked forward. The cabin was still far. Far enough to be invisible. But in her mind, the fire still burned. That red glow, flickering against old wooden walls, still danced behind her eyelids. She wasn't dragging Brisa toward a house. She was pulling her toward warmth, toward a place that had never once turned away anything weak or wounded. Faro suddenly stopped. Calla turned quietly. He looked at her, as if to ask, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She only pressed her lips together, placed her hands back on the scarf, and pulled. But this time her body faltered. Both knees sank into the snow, shoulders collapsed inward, her back curling like a ribbon tied too tightly for too long. Her body froze, not from cold, but from exhaustion. Her breath came in short bursts. Each inhale felt like swallowing shards of ice. Her hands went slack. The scarf slipped from her grip. Brisa lay still behind her, the wound still blurred by frost. Faro stepped forward, gently placed his head on Calla's arm. A soft sound escaped. Not a whimper, but the shallow, raspy breath of a creature equally spent. But Faro didn't collapse. He stood by her side, unmoving. And when Calla looked into his eyes, she didn't see weakness. She saw the gaze of something that had never been taught how to fight a snowstorm, but chose to keep walking anyway, because it had to. Calla closed her eyes for a second. Her cheeks burned raw. Her fingertips had gone numb. But her heart, it still beat. And it beat harder when she thought of Faro. Of the day she lost her father, and no one carried her home. No one pulled her from the silence. She didn't want Faro to feel that. She didn't want him to lose the one thing that mattered. Calla braced her arms, pushed herself up. Her knees trembled, but her eyes still held light. She turned back, tightened her grip on the scarf. She had no strength left, but she had something stronger. Will. The wind blew harder, as if testing her. But this time, her steps pressed deep into the snow, no longer wandering. The gust that swept through the forest didn't howl, nor did it roar like the storm earlier that morning. It whispered, soft, low like a voice from above, a language humans couldn't name, felt only through numbed skin, reddened ears, and the gaze of small beings still learning how to rise again. Pharaoh sat directly in front of her, his little paws resting on the edge of the scarf. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply looked. A gaze that didn't ask for anything, didn't demand, didn't accuse. In those dark, round eyes, there was only one thing: waiting. Not waiting for her to be extraordinary, just waiting for her voice. Calla remained on her knees, palms pressed into snow already hollowed beneath her. Her breath came in uneven bursts. Her heart felt like it might split. Not from fatigue, but from something else. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Not her mother, not the neighbors, not the quiet therapy sessions or the paper notes. It was Pharaoh, this stubborn, fragile creature whose eyes made every reason to give up seem small. Calla lowered her head. A drop fell onto the scarf wrapped around Bressa. It wasn't snow. It was a tear. She didn't sob. She only shook. Her small shoulders curled inward like she was hugging herself. She had held it together for so long, not because she was ready, but because there had never been anyone to fall into. But now, with Pharaoh's eyes waiting, the feelings spilled out, like a door forced open after a winter too long. A tiny sob escaped, barely audible outside the pine forest. Then she bit her lip and lifted her face. Pharaoh tilted his head, eyes unwavering. And then, softly, like the first drop shattering the thinnest ice, Calla spoke. Her voice was hoarse. So hoarse it sounded like it had been stuck in her throat for 1,000 days. But it was real. I won't give up. Just that. But enough to still the wind for a second. Pharaoh blinked, then took a step forward. His nose touched the back of her hand, a touch so gentle it whispered, "I knew you wouldn't." Calla wiped her face with a sleeve already soaked through. Snow clung to the edges of her hair, some strands curling from the cold. But her eyes were no longer dull. They held fire. A kind of light she hadn't known still lived inside her. She took a deep breath, her fingers slowly tightening around the ends of the scarf. Tilting her head, she looked at Bressa, still motionless, still breathing, still alive. And so, Calla stood up. Not like before, unsteady and stumbling. This time she rose straighter, though her legs still trembled. The wind struck her face. She turned her head against it, then exhaled firmly. Her lips whispered once more, like a promise to herself, "I won't give up." A pull of the hands, a tilt of the shoulders. The scarf stretched again, and Bressa shifted forward across the snow. Pharaoh walked beside her, not to lead, but to witness, to be there. Every time Calla paused to catch her breath, Pharaoh looked toward her, and whenever she lowered her head, Pharaoh stepped in, nudging her shoulder gently, like a silent pat of encouragement. The path didn't grow shorter, but in Calla's heart, it no longer felt far. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was what had to be done. She wasn't the strongest. But in that moment, she was brave enough to say what no one had ever asked her to say. Brave enough to pull a life back home with nothing but her small, shaking hands. Above, the sky had softened. Snow still fell, but thinner now. A few pale rays slipped through the pine branches, painting faint streaks of light across her flushed cheeks. And Pharaoh, glancing back now and then, kept walking slowly beside her, like a witness to the first time she spoke aloud what she believed in. The path home was like an invisible slope, neither uphill nor downhill, just stretching endlessly between two rows of towering pines. Calla had lost track of how long she'd been pulling Bressa. Each step felt measured in final breaths, in clenched fists grown numb. She didn't know what kept her moving, strength, will, or the simple weight of the words she had spoken not long ago. I won't give up. The wind had gentled, but the cold still seeped in. She could no longer feel her fingertips, only the increasing weight of the scarf. Pharaoh remained at her side, his short legs trailing behind her staggered pace. And every time Kala stopped to breathe, Pharaoh turned to look, as if to say, "If you fall back, I'll go ahead for you." And then, finally, through a thick white haze, the familiar gray roof of the house appeared, sunken in snow like a memory that refused to fade. The front was nearly buried, windows blurred with ice, but the slanted wooden frame, still there, was the place she once curled beside each afternoon, watching winter drift by as slowly as today. Kala said nothing. She had no strength left to speak. Her legs moved forward, then again, and once more, until the toe of her boot touched the porch. She'd made it, almost there. But the door was closed. She didn't search for a key. She didn't call for her mother. She just summoned what remained in her shoulders, raised her foot, and kicked hard. The door flew open. The wind rushed in first. Then came the small frame of Kala, dragging behind her a body soaked in snow and blood, sliding across the hallway rug, straight into the living room. The fireplace hadn't gone out completely. The embers still glowed, scattered dots of red among the ash. The thin blanket draped over the couch was still there, the one Kala used to curl under like a cocoon, surviving a winter with no words. She pulled Brisa close to the fire. Her hands shook violently, but she loosened the scarf carefully, placing the dog's chest near the warm tile. Then, as if guided by some quiet instinct, not learned but born, Kala reached for the driest towel she could find and covered Brisa's body. Every movement clumsy, uncertain, but filled with the fierce effort of someone who would not let another creature feel abandoned. Pharaoh circled once, climbed up, and curled himself beside Brisa, wrapping his tiny frame around hers to share his heat. His tail flicked gently, covering her leg. No whining, no calling. Just a quiet presence that seemed to say, "You don't need to do anything anymore, just stay." Kala watched them, then suddenly dropped to the floor. Her arms fell to her sides. Her legs gave out completely. Her last breath came longer than the others. Not sharp, not strained, just released, as if she had let go of everything she had been holding for months. And then she cried. Not the loud, shaking cries from storybooks, but silent crying. Tears that spilled without a sound, each one carrying the weight of memories, thought long forgotten. Evenings spent waiting for the sound of her father's truck. The notes her mother left behind. The school days that ended with no one asking, "How was your day?" She cried for Pharaoh, for Brisa, and for herself, because maybe, for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in this world of wind and fogged windows. She fell asleep not long after. No pillow, no blanket, no goodnight words. Just her small head resting against Brisa's side, her hand still draped across the towel covering her belly. Pharaoh shifted slightly, placing his chin on her wrist, as if guarding the sleep of the one who had brought his mother home. The fire gave one gentle pop, a tiny flare of light, not brilliant, but just enough to keep the warmth alive for a few more hours. That night, in a house that had forgotten the sound of voices, 3 small lives slept beside each other, silent, but finally at peace. The door swung open against the gust, and a wave of dry snow fell across the thick shoulders of Rowan's coat. Her medical boots pressed into the cold wooden floor, the edges of her white gloves soaked from melting snow. She moved quickly, the first aid bag tapping against her hip with each step, just like every night after her shift, when she returned to the house where her daughter waited, in silence. But tonight, that silence was gone. The fireplace still burned faintly, and on the floor, in the dim light cast by glowing embers, was a scene that made Rowan's heart tighten as if clutched by invisible hands. Calla, her child who no longer spoke, no longer hugged, no longer responded, was asleep on the floor, her head resting against the body of a full-grown dog, wrapped in bloodied towels and faint breath. Next to them, a puppy curled up, his head placed gently on her wrist like a guardian of something precious. Rowan froze. She didn't think. The bag slipped from her fingers. In the beat of a heart, time slowed, and she was on her knees. Calla. Her daughter's name left her lips like a long-forgotten prayer. Her hand trembled as it touched Calla's cheek, still warm, flushed from the cold, but not frostbitten. The girl's forehead pressed into the soft fur along Brisa's neck, eyes shut, lips slightly parted, as if still dreaming of snow and the breath of life. Rowan touched her hand. Then her chest, feeling for a pulse. Steady, but tired. The smell of blood and damp snow clung to the towel wrapped around Brisa. Rowan's hand moved down, touching the matted fur, then the hardened scab across the wound. She didn't yet know what had happened. Only that all three, her daughter, the puppy, and a dying mother dog were here together, in the middle of a snowstorm, breathing faintly, tethered by something invisible now drawn back into place. Pharaoh stirred, lifting his head to meet her gaze. Rowan exhaled hard, forcing down the swell in her chest. Then she reached out, touched Calla's shoulder, softly, barely more than a breath. Calla, can you hear me? Seconds passed. Nothing moved. Until a sound broke the silence, small but sharp enough to shatter every winter that had weighed on Rowan's heart. Mom? Calla whimpered, then opened her eyes. The haze faded slowly into focus. She saw her mother, tried to sit up, but her shoulders were too sore. Her hand barely reached the hem of Rowan's coat, but even that was enough to shake the woman to her core. I came back, Calla said. Her voice was hoarse, but clear, as if every day she had waited had folded into this one sentence. Rowan couldn't stand anymore. She sank all the way down, pulled her daughter into her arms, wrapping those small, soaked shoulders tightly, just enough to feel the heartbeat beneath the thick, damp cotton. You came back, she choked out, resting her forehead against Calla's. Oh God, you really came back. No words could describe the feeling, when a mother who believed she'd lost her child, not in body but in spirit, was suddenly called Mom again by that same child. The hug didn't end quickly. The fire popped faintly behind them, its flame flaring just enough to reflect the warmth now filling the hollow spaces between them. What followed was a quiet whirlwind of care and love. Rowan dressed Bryce's wounds, warmed new water, replaced Calla's damp scarf. She said little, but her tenderness filled every movement. Pharaoh stayed beside his mother. Calla stayed beside Pharaoh. And Rowan, for the first time in so long, no longer felt alone in this journey. A house, no matter how snow-laden its roof, no matter how wind seeped through its cracks, was still a home when someone whispered, Mom, and lit a fire in someone else's chest. Morning light trickled through the sheer curtain, not summer bright, but enough to stir the room awake from a long sleep. Warmth from the fire spread evenly now, no longer shy like the night before, but full, recognizing that someone here, at last, wanted to live again, in the house once filled only with handwritten notes, where footsteps echoed for lack of response, there were now steady breaths, the sound of water pouring gently, the soft touch of cloth meeting fur, tiny sounds, yet carrying the weight of something real. Rowan knelt on the rug beneath Brisa. Her hands, once trained to treat human wounds, now moved carefully through blood-soaked fur. Gauze, sutures, antiseptic. Her tools were laid out neatly like a temporary clinic. But her face no longer held the focus of a nurse on duty. It carried the stillness of a mother healing something far deeper. Brisa didn't resist. Each time disinfectant touched an open cut, she flinched, but she didn't growl. Faro stayed pressed to her side, never breaking his gaze from Rowan's hands. He didn't know medicine, but his eyes held unwavering trust. Nearby, Kala quietly folded a blanket. The one that had kept her warm now draped neatly over a single-seater by the fire. She folded the scarf used to pull Brisa home, pressing each edge flat, even though it was still soaked and stained. Then she picked up a small basin, emptied the water, and replaced it with fresh warmth, lining the bottom with a dry towel before setting it gently beside Faro's paws. Faro, though uninjured, was cared for like a fragile child after a heavy storm. Kala gently placed a bowl of water beside him, then ran her hand softly down his spine. She said nothing, but her gaze held a tenderness deeper than words. In a room that had once been the refuge of silence, every movement, every brush of cloth, every clink of a spoon against a bowl was now weaving a new kind of presence. Not noisy, not hurried, but real. A home, slowly returning to life. Rowan finished the final stitch and exhaled with quiet relief. "All done," she murmured. Not meant for anyone in particular, yet Kala looked up, and Faro's tail tapped lightly against the floor. "You all did so well," Rowan added, her voice soft and steady, meant for Brisa, for her daughter, and for Faro. They shared a late breakfast, just toasted bread and reheated potato soup, but Kala ate every bite, no hesitation, no avoiding. She brought the bowl close to Faro, feeding him small spoonfuls, then smiled, not a loud, gleeful smile, but one that made her lashes tremble in the morning light. Rowan sat beside them, not interrupting, only watching, as if afraid that if she joined in, the miracle might dissolve. But it didn't. It stayed, moment by moment. The fireplace kept burning, dry wood crackling like a steady heartbeat. On the windowsill, the snow had thinned, revealing misted glass and a pale sliver of morning sky. Kala laid another blanket under Brisa. She moved slowly, not out of exhaustion, but from a carefulness born of love. Faro stretched and rested his head on her lap. She let him. Her hand continued stroking his fur, her eyes fixed gently on Brisa. "She's going to be okay," Rowan said softly, not to reassure, but as something she believed with certainty. Kala didn't answer right away. She turned to her mother and gave a quiet nod. No more words were needed. Because today, something had returned to this house that had long been missing. Life. Not loud, not dazzling, but warm enough to make no one feel like they were surviving alone anymore. That night, wind still slipped through the cracks of the old wooden frame, but it no longer carried the lonely whistle it once did. The house was warmer, not just from the fire, but from steady breathing, the faint rustle when Faro turned in his sleep, and the soft sigh Kala let out each time she adjusted beneath the thick blanket Rowan had tucked around her. Brisa lay curled near the hearth, shifting occasionally. The wound still ran deep, but it no longer bled. Rowan had cleaned it again, closed it with precise stitches, and applied balm to ease the tension beneath the skin. Kala slept nearby, nestled between Faro and Brisa, like a small anchor tethering two healing lives. And then, For the first time after countless nights filled with blank stillness, Calla dreamed. In that dream, there was no fire, no smoke, no sirens or panic, only a red clay path winding through tall green pines where the breeze whispered and sunlight filtered gently through the leaves. Her father stood there, the same tall, slender figure in a faded shirt and worn-out canvas hat. He didn't speak. He just smiled. Calla didn't run to him. She stood still, watching. But that smile loosened something in her chest, like a knot gently undone. He reached out, not to summon her, but to say, "I see you. From here, I still see you." She walked toward him, slowly. The ground beneath her feet was soft with dry grass, the scent of pine drifting through like breath. And when the distance closed enough for her to hear the rustle of his clothes in the wind, he tilted his head and smiled even more deeply, pointing to something behind her. She turned and saw Pharaoh standing tall beside Brisa. Both were whole again, their coats gleaming under the sun. Pharaoh dashed forward and leapt into her arms, and Calla laughed. Not a loud laugh, but the kind that made her shoulders bounce, her lips curve like joy had never fractured. She bent to hug Pharaoh, and felt the warmth of his chest press gently against her heart. When she awoke, dawn hadn't fully arrived. The window pane was fogged, catching reflections of the last embers flickering in the hearth. Calla didn't rise. She remained on her side, one hand resting lightly on Pharaoh's curled form at her feet. Outside, snow still fell, soft and steady like dusted rain. She leaned down, whispering as if to greet the morning itself, "I think he sees me now." Pharaoh didn't move. He simply opened his eyes, looked at her, and rested his head on her leg as if answering. No barking, no dramatic gesture, just a stillness so gentle, so quietly certain. Calla closed her eyes again, not to sleep but to rest. Her throat no longer clenched the way it had every morning. She didn't have to swallow to push back that familiar tightness. She thought of her dream, of her father's outstretched hand in the sun, of Pharaoh's cheek pressed to her leg. And she sang, not to speak, just to sing. A faint melody, wordless and trembling like a breeze brushing over snow. Tentative at first, then fuller with each breath. Her voice didn't travel far, only far enough for Pharaoh to breathe a little deeper, for Brisa's tail to twitch faintly, and for Rowan, dozing lightly in the wooden chair across the room, to slowly open her eyes and feel something had shifted in the air. A voice, soft, wavering, almost too fragile to be called singing, drifted through the house. A sound that hadn't existed here for months. A song with no words, yet filled with a quiet belief that morning would come. Not because someone promised it, but because warmth could be made and shared by those who chose to stay. The sudden bark that sliced through the stillness of the night made Rowan jolt awake. Pharaoh never barked without reason. At the same moment, Calla sat up, heart pounding, not just from fear, but from something deeper, a tugging certainty she couldn't explain. Pharaoh stood alert by the window, the fur along his back lifted, his tail tapping the floor in steady rhythm. His eyes didn't leave the forest edge. Another bark rang out, short, precise, not a cry but a call or a warning. "Something's wrong," Rowan whispered as she rushed toward the supply cabinet. She grabbed the large flashlight from its hook, flipping the switch, sending a beam of light slicing through the frost-veiled glass. Calla had already moved to Pharaoh's side, her hand resting lightly on his head. She didn't tremble. She wasn't the same girl who used to fear the dark. She looked at her mother, then gave a single nod. "We have to go." Rowan didn't hesitate. She threw a coat over Calla's shoulders and opened the door. The cold wind hit their faces like a wall, but this time, they didn't stop. They moved in silence, Pharaoh leading the way, Rowan's flashlight drawing a long, narrow path through the deep snow. Kala stayed close, her boots landing directly in Pharaoh's paw prints, each one deliberate, unwavering. As they reached a low-hanging pine branch, Pharaoh suddenly stopped. A low growl rumbled from his throat before he veered sharply to the left. Rowan turned the beam in that direction, and the light landed on a figure. A man curled beneath the base of a tree. His coat was stiff with frost, arms wrapped tightly around his chest. His face was pale as ash, lips cracked, breath faint, barely visible. "Oh, God!" Rowan gasped and hurried over. Kala froze for a heartbeat, then followed, unsure but not panicked. Rowan checked for a pulse. "He's alive," she whispered, then turned to Kala. "Wrap your scarf around his neck, quick, keep the heat in." Kala nodded, unwinding her scarf without a second thought, helping her mother pull the man's coat tighter. Pharaoh stood protectively in front of them, eyes sharp, body braced against the cold. Then, Brisa appeared, steady, silent, as if her injuries had vanished. No one called her. She simply came. Kala saw it, the way Brisa lowered her head, sniffed the man's face gently, then licked his hand. It was more than affection. It was instinct, recognition, response. "She used to be a search and rescue dog," Rowan murmured, like remembering something that had never truly left. "She knows what he needs." Minutes passed. Enough heat, enough pressure, enough presence. The man stirred, his breath still labored, but his eyes fluttered open, seeing 3 faces, 2 humans and 1 dog, all watching over him. Thank you," he rasped, his voice like thawing ice. Rowan gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're safe now. We're bringing you home." Kala didn't speak. She simply added another blanket to his legs. Pharaoh approached and gently rested his head on the man's thigh. Brisa remained still, locking eyes with him, then slowly closed hers. It was trust, unspoken and complete. They walked back under a sky so still it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The man was laid down on the long bench by the fire, now wrapped in thick blankets. Rowan started an IV, cleaned his wounds, applied gauze where needed. Kala brought a steaming bowl of porridge. Pharaoh curled up at his feet. Brisa sat beside him. No one asked his name. No one needed to. No one recounted what had happened. But inside that little house, among those who had found one another again, something clear took root. Life, once again, had been held onto. Because of a bark in the night. Because of the instinct of a dog they thought was fading. And because of love from those who once believed they had no strength left to give. News of the man rescued from the woods in the middle of a snowstorm spread faster than the thawing creek at the edge of the village. Within just 2 days, gentle knocks began to echo across the wooden porch of the house at the edge of North Hollow, a place that had grown used to nothing but wind and quiet breaths. It wasn't that anyone wanted to disturb that stillness. It was simply that everyone felt they needed to come. Mrs. Idra, the elderly neighbor who lived 3 cabins down the path, was the first to arrive. She brought with her a cloth sack filled with slow-cooked beef bones. "For the brave lady dog," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I heard. She's the one who kept him alive." Brisa was lying beneath the soft morning sun by the window. She raised her head, ears twitching, then gently moved toward the small bowl Kala had just placed. She didn't rush to eat. She sniffed first, licked once, and then looked up at Kala. The girl smiled softly. "She's still polite." Mrs. Idra settled into the old armchair and rolled up her sleeves. "That girl once saved both my grandkids. The fire at the North Woods camp. You remember that, Rowan? Rowan, just stepping out from the kitchen with a pot of hot tea, paused mid-step. You mean the one from 8 years ago? Mrs. Edra nodded. Yes. The smoke was too thick that day. The adults panicked. But this dog, she was still young back then, ran into the flames and found the kids hiding under a bed. No one taught her to do that, but she did it anyway. Calla sat quietly beside Faro. Her eyes stayed on Brisa, not like someone looking at the present, but as if seeing a living piece of the past for the very first time. You know, Edra turned to Calla. Back then, the whole village called her Brisa the Light. That story, which seemed like a simple old memory, became the spark that opened up a stream of recollections long buried in the hearts of North Hollow's people. The next morning, the hunched blacksmith came by with a roasted marrow bone. By afternoon, a group of school kids from town stopped at the door, leaving behind a small bouquet of dried flowers tied with a red ribbon, and a handwritten note. Thank you, Brisa. You taught me what courage looks like. Rowan stood in the kitchen, watching as Calla carefully arranged the gifts in the corner cabinet beside the window. No one told her to. No one reminded her. But she did it with a reverence that hadn't been seen before. Rowan walked over and gently placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Brisa used to be the pride of this village, but after that fire, she was sent to a rescue station in the south. My brother, Uncle Evan, was the one who trained her. I remember the day she first came to our house. Faro hadn't even been born yet. It was just Brisa and your father. Calla looked up. Dad used to talk about her. Rowan nodded. When he was still alive, he called her the forest guardian who never needed commands. That night, under the soft yellow glow from the fireplace, the house seemed to open up in a new way, not just a shelter from silence, but a place where the stories once remembered by North Hollow could return. Brisa lay stretched at Calla's feet, her large body no longer curled up from pain, but resting with ease. The wound had been cleaned and carefully dressed. The occasional whimpers of discomfort had faded, replaced by steady, peaceful breaths. Faro nestled between mother and daughter, ears drooping in drowsiness, though his half-lidded eyes still kept watch on the door, the same door that had led so many unexpected things to them. Calla picked up her small sketchbook and, for the first time, drew a living figure. Not a pine tree, not a rooftop, but Faro and Brisa curled beside each other. At the bottom she wrote a small caption in pencil. The one who once saved, now being saved. Mornings in North Hollow no longer felt piercing cold. The thin patches of snow on the front steps had begun to melt, leaving streaks of water threading through the aging wooden grooves. On the wool rug by the door, sunlight slanted across Brisa's grayish-brown coat, now no longer spiked from pain, but softened, smoother, and tinged with warm, earth-like tones. Brisa wasn't lying still anymore. Today was the first day she tried to stand. Calla had been up early. She sat at the table, hugging her notebook filled with sketches. On the newest page, in the upper left corner, was a small, slanted line of writing. The first day, if Pharaoh's mother can rise, then so can I. She didn't write it big. She didn't need to make it bold, because the way Pharaoh watched his mother, the way his small ears perked up every time Brisa moved, said more than any sentence could. Brisa shifted. Calla exhaled softly, gripping her pencil tighter. Each time Brisa nudged her body a little, Pharaoh stretched his own, afraid to miss even the slightest movement. He never looked away, not even for a second, his tiny paws keeping just enough distance to be close, just enough to reach her if she fell. Rowan stood by the doorway, arms crossed gently. She didn't say a word. She simply allowed the moment to unfold like a quiet ritual, One of those rare moments when everyone instinctively knew not to speak, like hearing someone's voice again after a year of silence. Brisa tensed slightly, raising her injured left leg. It still trembled faintly, but the muscles beneath her coat had started to gather strength. Pharaoh inhaled softly, a sound barely audible, yet distinct in the still room. Kala gave a tiny nod, as if echoing the sentiment. Brisa's paw touched the floor. Kala set her pencil down. "She did it," she mouthed, not yet turning it into sound. Half an hour later, Kala sat on the rug with her sketchbook open and scribbled a new line. Brisa stood up. Pharaoh didn't bark. He just watched, and that look made me want to cry. Pharaoh curled up beside his mother, head still held high. Brisa had moved 3 small steps toward the fireplace, each one causing her weight to shift, but her eyes never wavered from the path ahead. Kala noticed it, the way Brisa's gaze never once dropped. Her legs were unsteady, but her focus was firm. Every time Brisa wobbled, Pharaoh edged forward half a step. He didn't nudge, didn't assist. He just stayed close enough for his warmth to be felt beside hers. Kala turned slightly, angled her sketchbook, and began to draw. She didn't add many details, just a few strokes to suggest one large dog leaning forward and a smaller one beside it. It was enough to capture the entire morning. Then came a moment that made Kala's heart skip. Brisa stopped, didn't take another step. Maybe she was tired. Pharaoh lifted his head and gently touched her ear with his tongue, a light lick, just enough for her to feel. And then, as if that quiet gesture carried something no words could ever describe, Brisa took another step. Just one. But Kala clapped softly and let out a small laugh. She looked up at her mother. "Mom, Pharaoh isn't a puppy anymore. He's a companion now." Rowan nodded, her eyes softening with emotion. "And so are you, Kala." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pine trees, Kala opened her sketchbook and pressed a small dried leaf inside, one she'd found in the backyard. Today's page was titled, "First Steps for Pharaoh's Mom and for Me." She added, "No one needed to tell me to try. I just saw how Pharaoh looked at his mother, and suddenly I wanted to stand up too, for a reason more beautiful than any reason." When Kala turned off her bedside lamp that night, Pharaoh was still lying beside Brisa. His eyes watched the faint glow of the fireplace, but his body stayed alert, as if still waiting. Kala walked over quietly and ran her hand down Pharaoh's back. "Tomorrow I'll place a few stones to make a path easier for her," she whispered. Pharaoh closed his eyes. Brisa breathed calmly. Outside the porch, the snow had finally stopped falling. That morning, sunlight didn't hesitate as it slipped past the window. It poured in fully, touching every corner of the room and casting a warm glow across the stack of papers next to Kala. She sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, a worn-out box of crayons beside her, holding a pencil so short it barely fit her fingers. But her expression was calm and steady, as if she were touching something sacred. Brisa and Pharaoh lay not far away. Brisa could now sit upright. Pharaoh was fast asleep, yet one ear stood perked up, like even the sound of a crayon stroke could make him smile. Kala placed the final dot in her 18th journal entry, the first time she had ever written 3 full pages in a row without needing to pause. Not because things had gotten easier, but because she no longer feared forgetting anything. Everything was now kept on paper, alive and filled with color. On the first page of her small storybook, she drew a scene. A little girl stood in the middle of a storm, her purple coat whipping in the wind. Next to her were 2 dogs, one trembling, one standing guard. In the distance, a snow-blurred fence. Closer, a trail of footsteps fading toward home. Calla didn't write the girl's name, but anyone who saw the drawing would know it was her. Rowan stumbled upon that pile of drawings later that same afternoon, while rearranging books on the shelf and noticing an unusual light coming through the back of the cabinet. She crouched down, gently slid out a piece of cardboard, and underneath it was a neat collection of hand-drawn pages, each carefully taped down. The handwriting slanted like the first wobbly steps of her daughter years ago. Rowan sat beside her, saying nothing, flipping slowly through the pages. The first showed Calla carrying Pharaoh, snow clinging to her jacket. The second was a forest aglow with firelight, where a mother dog slept peacefully and a little girl sketched nearby. Each page was like a breath, soft, unhurried, and full of rhythm. "I just wrote what I remember," Calla murmured, eyes still on the page she was shading. Rowan gently brushed her daughter's hair aside. "The things you remember. Those are the things that truly happened. And they are beautiful." A week later, Calla's homeroom teacher called Rowan. "Calla brought in a bundle of papers today," she said. "She asked if she could share a story during our circle time. I didn't expect—" The whole class went completely quiet. I've never seen that before. Rowan paused. "Did she speak it aloud?" "Yes, no hesitation, no looking down. She just told it, holding one drawing in her hands, and with a look that no one could look away from. That afternoon, when Calla came home, she didn't say a word. She simply placed the stack of papers on the table, then climbed onto the sofa and sat beside Pharaoh. Outside, the sky hadn't fully darkened yet. Inside, the fire had already been lit. Rowan walked over and picked up the stack. The first page, still that familiar drawing. A little girl standing in the snow, flanked by two dog-shaped silhouettes. But now there was a new line written in violet ink. "Not everyone sees the most beautiful thing in the storm, but I did. And I want others to see it, too." Rowan couldn't hold back her tears. Not from sadness, but because, for the first time in years, Calla no longer wrote with letters tucked tightly into the paper's edges. She wrote big, centered, and left space around her words, as if no longer afraid of being swallowed by memory, as if she had learned how to rise from it. That night, Calla opened a fresh page and wrote, "Tomorrow I'll draw more. Maybe Brisa taking 5 steps, or the moment I sing to Pharaoh for the first time." She set the pencil down and turned to Pharaoh. "What do you think? Should I draw you lying across my lap?" Pharaoh gave a soft huff and rested his head gently on her legs, as if answering in a language that never needed words. From the kitchen corner, Rowan turned off the light and stood silently watching. In the flickering warmth of the firelight, this no longer looked like the cold house it once was. It felt like a world, redrawn from blank pages and retold through memory. Winter in North Hollow hadn't completely left, but signs of life were beginning to show on the dark pine branches. The ground was no longer blanketed in snow, but freckled with patches of young moss, like the forest skin beginning to breathe again after being buried. The wind no longer sliced through the air. It moved gently, like an old friend returning to whisper that it remembered. Calla tied her shoelaces and leaned down to pat Pharaoh's back. "Ready?" Pharaoh turned and wagged his tail. No more words were needed. They left the porch and stepped onto the trail beyond the trees. That path, 2 months ago, had been a journey of short breaths, bitter cold, and heavy legs. Now it opened like a memory gently brushed clean, clear and kind. Pharaoh walked a few steps ahead, ears flicking toward every rustle. His gait was no longer cautious, and he didn't need to check behind him, like when Brisa was still weak. He wasn't leading from fear anymore. He was leading because he understood. Calla followed. Her boots sank lightly into damp leaves, leaving fresh imprints over old ones. They passed the fallen log where Calla had once tripped, past the slope where Brisa had collapsed, past the bend where a gust of wind once left Calla gasping for breath. Now the wind still moved, but it carried no scream, only the pulse of things returning to life. At a flat patch of land, where once Calla had crumpled to her knees, Pharaoh paused. He didn't bark. He just looked forward, then stepped slowly toward a large tree with a curved root like a natural bench. Calla understood. She walked over and sat. Before her stretched an open forest, once blindingly white, now soft with moss and streaked sunlight. She placed her hand on the ground. She didn't cry, but her heart beat fast, like every cell in her remembered something carved deep into growing up. She looked at Pharaoh. "Thank you for not giving up." Pharaoh wagged his tail. Not fast, not wildly, just one steady sweep. The same tail that had once been soaked with snow, once too cold to lift, once too tired to wag. And yet today, it still moved, steady, enduring, like the quiet love Pharaoh had carried the whole way through. Calla reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper, the last page of the notebook she had brought with her this whole journey. No words, just a pencil sketch. A little girl sitting beside a dog, in a forest with no snow. There was nothing more to write. Everything had already been spoken through the lines. She placed the paper on the tree root, securing it with a small stone she picked up along the trail. For anyone who might walk by, so they know some paths began with a miracle. Pharaoh laid down beside her. His head rested on Calla's legs, eyes half closed, as if he too was seeing both past and present at once. By the time they returned, the day was dipping into dusk. Their shadows stretched longer across the path, but carried no weight. They were simply the shapes of two beings walking side by side, no longer swept by the wind, no longer lost in fog. At the gate, Calla turned to Pharaoh. "We're home." And for the first time, without signing, without writing, without drawing, Calla laughed. Out loud. In the small wooden house at North Hollow, Brisa lay by the window, sunlight warming her dark coat. Pharaoh bounded in, gave her ear a quick lick, then curled beside her, glancing back at Calla. The girl stepped inside, gave a quiet nod, as if all three had just completed a journey, one that needed no recognition, no medal, just a path walked that would leave no one lost again. That evening, North Hollow welcomed a soft veil of mist, like a sheer scarf draped across rooftops and treetops. The breeze wasn't harsh, just cool enough to make someone pull their coat tighter, draw the curtains, and light another lamp. In the small house by the forest's edge, 3 bowls had been set carefully on the rug in front of a fireplace that had been glowing since early afternoon. One was Pharaoh's, with a few new scratches from when Calla had accidentally dropped it while rushing to serve dinner. One was Brisa's, gently cleaned by Rowan, with a dried silvergrass stalk placed beside the rim, as if to offer a formal welcome. And the third bowl was Calla's, still the same one she'd used since the start of winter, but now placed beside the other 2, no longer on the table, no longer apart. Rowan stood quietly at the kitchen, still holding a towel, her eyes resting on the 3 figures sitting together like a cluster of light in the heart of the room. Calla sat cross-legged, her hair a little messy, cheeks flushed from having just dashed down to the cellar for the last jar of pickled turnips. Pharaoh was on her right, chewing intently on a slice of bread soaked in broth, glancing toward Brisa as if checking whether she was managing to eat. Brisa, slower and more deliberate, took tiny bites, her ears twitching slightly every time Calla giggled, as if that sound alone made her feel safe enough to go on with the meal. The sight softened something in Rowan's chest, like the first sip of warm ginger tea on a bitter winter night. "Go on. Keep telling it," Rowan said as she poured water and pulled her chair closer. Calla looked up, a bit of mashed potato still on her lip. "Where were we, Mom?" "The part where Pharaoh noticed the dent in the snow, and you realized it was Brisa." Pharaoh, hearing his name, gently wagged his tail. The soft thump it made against the wooden floor wasn't loud, but it was clear, like a quiet nod. Calla nodded thoughtfully, then picked up her story again, her voice steady, her eyes glowing under the warm lamplight. "The snow was deep that day, but Pharaoh kept staring in the same direction. I didn't understand at first, but then I followed. And when I saw that sunken patch in the snow, I knew." Brisa looked up at that moment, her gaze on Calla. No bark, no reaction, but her eyes, warm and deep like flickering fire behind dry logs, made Calla pause for a moment. She reached out, resting her hand gently on Brisa's head. "You did so well." Rowan said nothing. She just watched her daughter, the same child who hadn't spoken for months, now telling a story of life and near death, as if recounting a soft dream. For a brief moment, the house felt more whole than it had ever been, not because of the fire or the light, but because of three souls, a mother who had known loss, a child who had once gone silent, and two beings who had nearly given up on hope, now sharing a meal in the same space, with no distance left between them. Calla glanced at Pharaoh, then at Brisa. "You know, Mom, if I hadn't looked into Pharaoh's eyes that day, I think I would have turned back into the house. And if Pharaoh hadn't stayed so still, you wouldn't have seen anything," Rowan replied softly. Calla smiled, turning to rest her head on her mother's lap. "But now I want to tell it, because if I don't, it might disappear." Rowan leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're no longer the girl who only writes things down." "I still write," Calla said, "but now I'll tell them too." Outside, the wind slipped through the pine ridge like a lullaby. The lights in the house didn't flicker. They burned steady and warm. On the table, the old oil lamp remained, its soot-blackened rim kept intentionally, as a reminder of nights that once seemed never-ending. And in the hearts of the three, human, canine, and silence, there was nothing left that needed to be carried alone. That dinner, just 3 bowls and a few simple dishes, was the first time Calla didn't feel like someone was missing. No knock on the door, no chime, no announcement. Family, in the end, was simply sitting together with no need to explain a thing. Sunset in North Hollow always came later than in other places, as if the sun, too, wished to linger a little longer over this land, withdrawing its last golden threads slowly through the branches, leaving a rosy veil atop the hill like a soft scarf in the air. The wooden porch smelled of toasted bread and fresh hay Rowan had just spread near Brisa's trough. No one said a word. But this silence felt different than in months past. No longer a wall, but a long-held breath, meant to savor every passing moment. Calla sat on the floor, her back leaning gently against her mother's legs. Pharaoh rested his head on Calla's lap, eyes half closed as if listening to the rustling leaves, yet never letting go of the familiar rhythm of her breath. Brisa lay a short distance away, her head turned towards the forest, not out of fear, but habit, always guarding, always listening. But this time, her eyes were softer, as if, finally, she had found a place calm enough to let herself lie down without watching the shadows. Calla turned her head toward the distant treetops, where the fading light turned every branch, every leaf into gold, and where heavy steps had once crossed to bring back a miracle. "Mom," she whispered. Will they leave? Rowan paused for a second, then glanced down at Pharaoh, then over to Brisa. A breeze brushed past her hair, carrying the soft chime of the wind bells swaying in the corner of the porch. She smiled. Number because this time, they're the ones who found us. Calla didn't say anything else. But her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the forest met the sky, where memories once felt like scars would now gently become the background of a quiet light. Her small hand gently patted Pharaoh's shoulder. Then let's stay, she murmured, not needing Pharaoh to nod, only needing the steady warmth of his breath through that thick coat to know. Brisa stretched, shifted slightly, and exhaled. It wasn't a sigh of exhaustion, but the sound of a weight being let go, like someone who had just set down their burden after a journey too long to count. Rowan reached for an extra shawl and draped it softly over Calla's shoulders. It's not cold tonight, but I think you'll want to hold on to this warmth a little longer. Calla nodded. I'm not cold anymore. I just want to sit a little longer. Dusk deepened. The light turned from gold to orange, then slid toward soft violet at the edge of the clouds. None of the four moved. Each silhouette became a still beat of time. Mother, daughter, Pharaoh, and Brisa, like puzzle pieces that had waited years to find each other, and now, finally, fit without force. Calla touched her wrist, the place where she used to stick paper notes with scribbled thoughts. There was no paper now, but the motion stayed, like a quiet reminder that some things aren't written down to be remembered. They're lived, so they cannot be forgotten. I'll write about today, she said. Rowan looked over. What will you write? About Pharaoh resting his head on me, about Brisa no longer needing to guard, about you sitting with me like this. I like that part, Rowan smiled. I like the part where you said, they're the ones who found us. A small sparrow zipped past the porch beam, chirping once before vanishing into a sky turning gently purple. Calla leaned back, resting fully into her mother's embrace. In that quiet moment, Pharaoh nudged his nose into her palm. Calla lowered her head and pressed her forehead to his. Brisa lifted her gaze, watching them both, then let out a breath, as if finally accepting that this world might still be kinder than she once believed. As the last edge of the sun dipped away, Rowan stood and held out her hand. Come inside. Yes, but we'll come back here tomorrow, right? Of course. Pharaoh sprang up beside Calla, while Brisa followed at a slower pace, though her steps no longer trembled like they once did. As the four returned to the house, the porch light switched on, casting its warm glow backward onto the threshold, the place that once marked the edge of everything old, and now the beginning of something new. The place where light was found wasn't a dot on a map. It was where a child reclaimed her voice, where a rescued dog became a rescuer, and where a mother no longer had to fight her solitude alone. Not all miracles strike like lightning or arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they start with a single glance, between a girl and a trembling dog in the snow. Sometimes they begin in silence, and it's that very silence that opens the door to healing. Calla, Pharaoh, and Brisa's story wasn't extraordinary, and perhaps that's why it cuts so deeply, because all of us, at some point, have known what it means to feel lost, to carry a pain that has no name. And sometimes, all it takes is one small gesture, a nod, a hand held, or the loyal gaze of a German shepherd, to change everything. German shepherds aren't just brave, intelligent, or heroic as seen in films or on battlefields. They carry something quieter, steadfastness, the kind that keeps someone from falling when the world feels like it's pulling away. Love these creatures, not just because they deserve it, but because when you offer them a home, a meal, or simply a gentle glance, you may find that it is you who begins to heal. And if anyone ever asks, "What is a miracle?" just point to Pharaoh, point to Kala, and say, "It's when two hearts that thought they were lost find each other again in the middle of winter,